Hey guys, tonight we drift into a world where status is whispered through soup, and social ambition is carved, yes, quite literally, into root vegetables. You're about to float through flickering banquet halls where soft violins hum, lace fans flutter, and somewhere near the far end of the table, a carved turnip swan glistens under candlelight. It's 19th century Europe, and the humble turnip, earthy, knobbly, and usually sentenced to peasant stews, is dressed for the ball. The reality is, you probably wouldn't survive this banquet. Not because of food poisoning, although the jellied eel amuse-bouche might raise some eyebrows, but because you'd spend hours in a corset or cravat, expected to know the social meaning of a carrot rose versus a turnip rosette. It's the kind of place where a misplaced pickle garnish could derail a marriage proposal. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you're listening somewhere interesting, on a houseboat in Finland, or maybe your aunt's guest room in Vermont, drop your location and local time in the comments. Now dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You take a slow step forward into a cavernous, oak-paneled ballroom, lit by 100 candles perched precariously in crystal sconces. The air smells like beeswax, roast pheasant, and the earthy perfume of freshly washed root vegetables. You drift closer to a long table draped in imported damask, where gleaming silver trays hold tiny, glistening sculptures. Swans, lilies, even an entire Gothic cathedral, all made from carved turnips. Yes, turnips. A footman glides past in white gloves, rearranging a small bouquet of radishes with more reverence than one usually reserves for flowers. The guests haven't arrived yet, and that's lucky. For now, you get to observe without judgment. You lean in to examine a perfectly scalloped turnip, each fold mimicking the petals of a camellia. The scent is faintly peppery, fresh from the soil, but somehow elevated, like a peasant who just inherited a country estate. Historians still argue whether this peculiar culinary trend began in Austria or France, but by the early 1800s, wealthy hosts across Europe had developed a mild obsession with dressing up their meals, not just with sauces and herbs, but with sculptures carved from edible items, especially roots. Turnips were inexpensive, easy to shape, and, most importantly, they didn't spoil during long preparation hours. A rare blend of status and sturdiness, this wasn't just decoration. It was display. The table became a stage, and the meal a kind of edible opera. Banquets were not only for eating, they were meant to be admired, even feared. The amount of labor packed into each spread was a subtle power flex. You weren't just serving guests dinner, you were showing them you could command teams of servants, chefs, gardeners, and carvers, all for the sake of one meal, and what meals they were. In 1827, Lady Smythe of Wiltshire reportedly hosted a 12-course banquet with over 70 individual vegetable carvings, including a miniature replica of Stonehenge made entirely from turnips and marzipan. One guest fainted from the sheer absurdity of it all, though others say it was the wine, or the corset, or both. You walk around the table slowly. The turnips catch the candlelight in unexpected ways, casting soft, oblong shadows onto the linen. Some are polished to a waxy sheen, as if they'd been buffed with beeswax or perhaps elbow grease and social anxiety. Others are dyed gently pink or lavender with natural plant extracts, beetroot, cabbage water, elderberry, offering a soft pastel glow like watercolors made solid. It's important to remember that these decorations weren't intended to be eaten. In fact, eating the art was considered gauche, even rude. You were meant to admire the vegetable finery, whisper about it with your neighbor, and then carefully avoid it while reaching for the partridge en croûte. Behind the scenes, the kitchen would be in chaos. Dozens of junior cooks hunched over root vegetables with paring knives, sometimes working through the night. Their fingers numb, their eyes bloodshot, and the ever-present worry that one lopsided turnip goose might cost them their place in the household staff. These days, the idea of edible decor might sound like a Pinterest hobby gone rogue. But in the 19th century, it was very serious business. Manuals were published, some helpful, others wildly impractical, on how to properly dress a table with vegetable ornamentation. A certain Monsieur Lefebvre's 1842 guide suggested guests could spiritually engage with the soul of the root by pondering its transformation from humble crop to ornamental masterpiece. That's probably the 1842 version of telling someone to just vibe with the turnip. And while France and England may have led the trend, it wasn't contained to just them. Smaller German principalities, Russian courtly circles, even a few adventurous Dutch traders joined the root revolution. The fascination wasn't so much with the vegetable itself, but with what it symbolized: mastery over nature, domestic order, and above all, refined taste. You pause near the head of the table, where an ornate centerpiece towers above the rest. It's a tiered sculpture of mythical creatures: griffins, mermaids, a somewhat embarrassed-looking minotaur, all made of turnip, potato, and a hint of yam. The detail is ridiculous. One mermaid has fingernails, another is reading a tiny book, probably titled How to Pose Gracefully in Root Form. You chuckle softly. The air seems lighter here, the absurdity giving way to a kind of warmth. Maybe it's the candlelight. Or maybe it's the soft charm of a culture that once took turnips this seriously. And somewhere in the back of your mind, a gentle realization forms. History isn't just war, treaties, and plagues. Sometimes it's a perfectly carved swan gliding across a dinner plate, waiting to be admired but never, ever eaten. You drift a little farther down the table, the soles of your shoes hushed by thick carpets and centuries of expectation. This evening's event, imaginary, of course, but rooted in very real customs, carries with it the weight of social standing. You glance around at the empty seats soon to be filled by men in tightly buttoned waistcoats and women whose gowns take up more personal space than a modest cottage. But the real star tonight isn't nobility. It's the turnip. Polished, positioned, proud. It's odd, really, how something pulled from dirt could be promoted to centerpiece status. But in 19th century society, few things were as important as appearance. In a time before photography had truly taken hold, the dining table was the Instagram of the elite. Presentation equaled power. So it shouldn't surprise you that even vegetables had their own moment of glory. You stand now before a silver-framed menu, delicately handwritten with curling ink and unnecessarily frilly flourishes. Among the courses, roasted venison, pigeon pie, syllabub. But nestled discreetly between the more expected fare is a line that makes you pause. Table sculpture, root medley, non-edible. There it is, in elegant script. The root medley. A decorative item, not to be consumed. Meant to impress, never digest. Back then, the decorative use of food wasn't just for whimsy. It was a coded display of wealth and refinement. A beautifully carved turnip suggested that the host had the resources to commission frivolity. Why eat something that's functional when you can carve it into a replica of Westminster Abbey instead? Historians still debate whether these displays were purely performative or also held symbolic meanings. Did a table lined with blooming turnip roses suggest fertility? A desire for prosperity? Or was it simply that someone had a lot of extra vegetables and too much time? You lean in closer to one modest arrangement shaped like a hunting scene. A rider, horse, and hounds, all molded from parsnip and turnip with tiny beetroot eyes, seem frozen mid-gallop. The detail is astonishing. The horse's tail flicks mid-swish. The dog has individual carved teeth. You can practically hear the non-existent bark echoing under the vaulted ceiling. Beside you, a servant silently replaces a flickering candle, his gloved fingers trembling slightly. You imagine he's been up since dawn, buffing the silver and straightening the doilies, all under the ever-watchful eye of the butler, who takes turnip placement very seriously. And not just any turnip would do. No, this wasn't a grab-it-from-the-market sort of affair. These were specially grown turnips, cultivated in carefully maintained estate gardens, coddled from seed to harvest. Pale skin, perfect roundness, no blemishes, no bruises, the produce equivalent of a beauty queen. Some turnips were even judged and selected for their grain. Yes, grain. You didn't know root vegetables had grain, did you? Neither did most people. But in aristocratic kitchens, cooks whispered about it like sommeliers describing wine. A fine-grained turnip held its shape better, less splitting during carving, cleaner lines, fewer tears. In this candlelit world, where every flicker could throw a new shadow across your dining companion's powdered cheek, even vegetables had standards. You imagine a young kitchen boy, let's call him Edwin, sent back to the garden in shame because his turnip had a soft spot. Poor Edwin. He'd probably grow up to be a carrot man instead. But jokes aside, the pressure was very real, not just for the cooks and gardeners, but for the hosts. Every guest at this sort of gathering came armed with expectations and unspoken scoring systems. And nothing made or broke a meal faster than a sloppy centerpiece. You reach for a napkin, lace-edged, impossibly starched, and find it folded around a single delicate radish flower. Another whisper of the root decor craze. Unlike the turnip sculptures, these miniature accents were sometimes edible. But the line between art and meal was always blurry. If you bit into it, someone across the table might clutch their pearls. A faint clinking draws your eye to a mirrored corner of the room, where a butler has begun polishing the edge of an ornate tureen. Inside, you're told, lies a consommé so clear you could see your own vanity reflected in it. And yes, it will be garnished, gently, with thinly shaved, star-shaped turnip slivers. It's easy to laugh now, from your modern perch of microwave dinners and mismatched cutlery. But these performances mattered. They were rehearsed again, and sometimes choreographed like ballets. Forks landed with precision. Dishes arrived in military-accurate timing. And turnips? They stood still, gracing the room with a quiet grandeur, a vegetable's version of noblesse oblige. Not everyone approved. The satirical paper The Punch once printed a cartoon of a man proposing to a woman whose entire dowry appeared to be a crate of ornamental turnips. "Ah," she says, "but the grain is divine." Others scoffed that this was just another symptom of a class unburdened by practical concern. Still, the obsession continued. Dinner parties featured increasingly elaborate displays, miniature opera houses, royal crests, Greco-Roman columns, all rendered from parsnip, turnip, and the occasional courageous rutabaga. Some chefs began signing their work, literally, with clove-studded initials pressed discreetly into the base of a carrot chariot wheel. The trend had crossed borders, too. A Hungarian countess reportedly held a contest among her kitchen staff for the most lifelike turnip animal. The prize? A silver spoon. The winning entry? A lounging lion with an expression of mild judgment and exquisite root mane. So you pause here, at the end of the table, where the air grows stiller, quieter. A final sculpture, a simple bowl of peeled turnips, uncarved, unsullied, sits in stark contrast to the rest. A reminder, perhaps, of the vegetable's original purpose, or a quiet nod from a chef who knows that, Beneath all the glitz and dye and over-ambition, sometimes a turnip is just a turnip. You breathe in deeply. Earth, beeswax, roast fowl. A hint of lavender, maybe. The candlelight dances again, this time in the silver ladle being brought out for the next course. The show is just beginning. You haven't even tasted anything yet, and already you're full of impressions, scents, soft shadows, and the weighty absurdity of a society that once looked at a root vegetable and thought, yes, let's give it a top hat. You slide a little farther down the table, where a quiet hush seems to hum beneath the clink of crystal and the flutter of curtain lace. This section of the room is where it all began. Not the party, but the idea. The origin of edible decor. Long before this particular Victorian ballroom became the stage, earlier European courts had already started to elevate their food from sustenance to spectacle. You're standing now in a recreated vision of a 17th century French banquet. Imagine tall wigs, powdered cheeks, and all the unspoken tension of courtly favor wrapped inside a roast goose. Here, in the palace of Louis XIV, we find some of the earliest surviving descriptions of food being sculpted, not just sliced or plated, but transformed. It wasn't turnips at first, of course. The Sun King preferred sugar, spun, molded, dyed, and stacked into fantastical arrangements that glistened like glass and sent the kitchen staff into nervous sweats. But the principle was the same. Make the food do more than feed. Make it awe. Historians still argue whether these sugar spectacles directly influenced the vegetable craze of later centuries, or whether they evolved separately as parallel traditions in culinary showmanship. But the through line is clear. Food became theater. And like any good theater, it needed a set, props, and something vaguely ridiculous at its center. Cue the turnip. By the late 1700s, fruit and vegetables started elbowing their way onto centerpieces. First as accents, radish rosettes here, some citrus peel curls there, but slowly, confidently, they claimed the spotlight. Perhaps it was a backlash against sugar's expense. Perhaps it was just chefs getting bored. Or maybe, just maybe, it was a quiet rebellion by the kitchen staff, tired of being left out of the art world. Why should painters have all the fun when you had a perfectly good rutabaga and a small paring knife? You approach a sideboard stacked with old banquet diagrams, hand-inked blueprints for how a proper 19th century table should be dressed. Some are so detailed, they include turn-by-turn instructions for where to place each carved creature, leaf, or abstract root curl. They read like battlefield maps, but instead of soldiers, you're deploying tubers. One note catches your eye, scrawled in loopy script. Do not place goose near the cabbage swan. Caused confusion at last dinner. An occupational hazard in the world of edible stagecraft. As the 1800s unfolded, so too did the obsession with the picturesque. The Romantic movement swept across Europe, urging people to look at nature not just as resource, but as muse. And what is a turnip, really, but a tightly coiled piece of nature's poetry waiting to be unleashed by an overworked kitchen assistant with a steady hand? You pass a mirror and catch a glimpse of yourself in this imagined world. A curious observer, a little amused, a little enchanted. Your reflection seems to nod at you, as if to say, yes, this is absurd, but also strangely lovely. Back at the table, a new sculpture draws your attention. It's shaped like a weeping willow, with paper-thin turnip ribbons cascading down like branches. Someone's threaded sprigs of parsley at the base to resemble moss. It's soft, melancholy, and absurdly beautiful. The turnip is mourning something, and you're not sure what. But it feels polite to bow your head for a moment anyway. In the kitchen, 2 doors down, past the velvet drapes, a different kind of chaos unfolds. You can almost hear the distant scrape of knives against wooden boards. The head chef, probably French, likely temperamental, is barking orders while a teenage assistant tries not to cry over a failed attempt at carving a badger. The badger collapsed. So now it's a pile of mashed ambition. Meanwhile, the root cellar is a treasure chest. Crates of purple top, golden globe, snowball, and even the rare, and somewhat controversially imported, Japanese Hinona Kabu turnips await their fate. Some will be carved. Some will be juiced into dyes. A few might actually get eaten, though that would be a minor tragedy given their visual potential. You imagine one of the cooks, let's call her Margaret, stashing a particularly good turnip in her apron. Not to steal, but to admire later. Maybe it reminded her of her dog. Or maybe she's secretly keeping a turnip journal, April 3rd. Found one shaped like the Duchess's nose. The trend spreads outward, from the French court to the drawing rooms of Brighton, then leaping the channel to Vienna and Berlin. With each leap, it morphs a little. In Bavaria, a brief but intense craze for pickled vegetable dioramas takes hold. In Belgium, chefs begin blending turnip with beetroot to create a pink marbling effect that delighted guests and stained the table linens forever. Still, at the core of all this pageantry remains a shared belief that presentation is power. And the turnip, durable and unpretentious, becomes the unlikely ambassador of that idea. Now you find yourself near the musicians. They're tuning lutes, violins, and something that looks like a harp but sounds suspiciously like someone plucking a string on a fancy laundry rack. The music, when it begins, will be light and mostly ignored. Background harmony for chewing and murmuring, and the occasional gasp when someone spots a particularly well-carved turnip dolphin. You turn your gaze back to the long line of centerpieces, and a strange comfort settles over you. There's something soothing about how seriously this was once taken. The care, the precision, the absolute commitment to turning a root vegetable into art. It didn't feed anyone. It didn't change the world. But for a few candle-lit hours, it made people smile, whisper, and maybe, just maybe, forget the weight of expectation pressing on their brocade-covered shoulders. And isn't that what dinner is sometimes about? The music has started now, just as you expected. Light, meandering, and completely inoffensive. A quiet string trio tucked in the corner plucks and bows its way through something vaguely classical and vaguely forgettable. It's background noise in the best way, the kind that lets the soft clink of silverware and the polite hum of conversation take center stage. You're not part of the feast, but you're close enough to hear the rustle of linen napkins and the occasional scandalized whisper about the lady from Devon's third sherry. As the guests begin to arrive, you retreat slightly, finding a shadowed alcove that gives you a perfect view of the turnip parade without intruding. You're here for the stars, after all. The vegetables, not the guests. And tonight's theme? Variety. You might think a turnip is just a turnip, but tonight's table would like a word. This is no monochrome display of bulbous root sameness. No. This is a curated spectrum of turnip diversity that would make a seed catalog blush. Front and center is the purple top white globe, the classic showstopper of its time. With its striking color contrast and relatively uniform shape, it was the darling of banquet decorators across Britain. You spot it forming the domes of a scale model of the Royal Pavilion in Brighton, flanked by tiny obelisks made of salsify. There's even a miniature carriage carved from a particularly rotund specimen, complete with parsnip wheels and licorice whip reins. Cinderella would be proud. To its left is a more delicate entry, the golden ball turnip, with a mellow yellow hue that glows softly under the candlelight. These roots were often carved into lantern shapes and lit from within using tiny beeswax candles. The effect was gentle, romantic, and only slightly dangerous. Open flames and dried vegetable flesh aren't always the best of friends. Further along the table, you find the snowball turnip, so pale it's almost ghostly. Historians still argue whether this variety was favored purely for aesthetic reasons, or if it simply had better shelf life. Some period letters describe the snowball's flesh as butter smooth, while others dismiss it as a damp sponge in root form. One lady reportedly flung hers from a carriage window after an unfortunate tasting incident. Luckily, it landed in a hedgerow and was later carved into a sheep. Then there's the long white, a somewhat neglected cousin in the decorative world. Its shape made it a challenge for certain sculptures, but a gift for others. One bold chef used it as the spine of a dragon centerpiece, its elongated form lending itself naturally to the beast's curling tail. Children, who rarely attended these formal affairs, might have enjoyed that one. Everyone else just muttered about how unsettling the eyes looked. You pause to admire the table's seasonal coordination. Autumnal-themed banquets featured more of the richer-hued roots, goldens, purples, even tinted radishes masquerading as tiny gourds. Spring feasts, on the other hand, leaned into pale pastels and delicate petal forms. Some decorators even dappled their turnips with natural dyes derived from saffron or elderberry to give them a blush of unnatural and thus deeply impressive color. One little arrangement, barely the size of a tea saucer, catches your attention. It's a recreation of a farmer's market stall, complete with carved turnip baskets, bean pod sacks, and a single comically detailed carrot with a monocle. It feels like a joke, a wink from the chef, a reminder that even the grandest affairs can hide a little humor under their starch. Of course, not all guests appreciated the diversity. Some noblemen, men who likely hadn't picked up a knife unless it came with a roast, grumbled about the inconsistency of turnip firmness. One marchioness, notoriously hard to please, once sent back an entire centerpiece because the pink tint on her golden turnips clashed with her napkin embroidery. The scandal lasted 3 seasons, and yet the chefs persisted. Each turnip was selected with care, usually from estate gardens managed by head gardeners who kept secret notes about which rows produced the straightest roots or the deepest purples. These men, uncelebrated in their time, were the true artists behind the scenes. One diary entry from a Yorkshire gardener named Ephraim contains a simple but proud line. Produced a bulb near perfect in symmetry. Mrs. wept at sight. Not every banquet could afford such luxury, of course. In less lavish households, a single decorative turnip, carved into a delicate rose and perched in a bed of lettuce, might serve as the only centerpiece. But even there, the desire was the same: to transform the everyday into something quietly astonishing. The turnip's rise in banquet culture wasn't just about availability, it was about subtlety. Unlike gaudy pineapples or gilded sugar sculptures, turnips carried a quiet elegance. Their humble origins made their transformation all the more impressive. It was like putting a bonnet on a barn cat and entering it in a royal pageant, and somehow winning. You think about how tastes have changed. Today, we expect food to be plated beautifully, yes, but there's an unspoken rule that it must also be functional, edible, delicious. But here, in this room, function bowed to form. No one expected to bite into a sculpture. In fact, to do so would be scandalous, like licking a marble bust at a museum. A nearby couple whispers, admiring a particularly baroque sculpture involving 6 turnips, a single leek, and what appears to be an artistic reinterpretation of Napoleon's horse. You can't help but smirk. It's both ridiculous and delightful. Like most things at these events, your gaze floats back to the table as the candlelight flickers and glows across the array of roots. There's something dreamlike about the repetition of shapes, the slow fade of one variety into the next. It's calming. hypnotic even. A slow vegetable ballet. If a root vegetable could curtsy, it would be doing so now, and so you lean back against the velvet wall, surrounded by varieties you'd never think twice about in a grocery store, now transformed into works of ephemeral art. You feel something settle inside you, a soft awe, a strange comfort, an appreciation for a moment in time when people put this much care into something so utterly unnecessary and so wonderfully specific. Because sometimes beauty is reason enough. The music has grown just a touch livelier now, still sleepy, still safe, but with the faint suggestion that something is about to happen. Not a duel or a declaration, of course. No, the kind of happening you're in for tonight is far more refined, far more rooted. You glide gently into a different part of the ballroom, where the host's seat looms large at the head of the table. It's a high-backed chair, embroidered with mythological creatures and cushiony enough to absorb a good portion of your spine. But the chair is not what draws your eye. It's what sits in front of it. Tonight's fictional nobleman, Lord Edgeborn, let's say, is famously eccentric. Known for his obsession with precision, he once sent back an entire meal because the parsley garnish was curled clockwise rather than counter. His valet has been rumored to iron the tips of his shoelaces, so naturally he's taken an intense personal interest in the centerpiece. And that centerpiece? It's a turnip chateau, not just a house, a chateau. Complete with spires, buttresses, a tiny working drawbridge made of licorice rope, and a moat fashioned from aspic tinted pale blue. 4 footmen carried it in on a mirrored tray about an hour ago, their expression so serious you'd think they were transporting a newborn swan, which, incidentally, has happened at this house before. The chateau is an architectural feat, its walls made from stacked and shaved purple-top turnips, corners sealed with clove paste, and the windows cut so thin they're translucent. Inside, a single candle flickers, casting long shadows through each miniature room. You half expect a tiny vegetable duke to wander out, adjusting his cravat and muttering about taxes. Lord Edgeborn, of course, is not amused. He is studying the turnip tower with a monocle so powerful it probably doubles as a telescope. His brow furrows, his lips purse. A nearby servant tightens his grip on the serving spoon, just in case things get dramatic. The nobleman's standards are legendary. Once, at a summer luncheon, he demanded a radish to be recarved mid-course because it too closely resembled a neighbor's nose. The kitchen complied. Barely. Historians still argue whether patrons like Edgeborn truly appreciated vegetable art, or whether they simply saw it as a chance to showcase control. Was it a love of detail, or a craving to bend even nature to one's taste? The answer is, of course, yes, but the trend wasn't limited to fussy men with too much land. Ladies, too, had their preferences, and occasionally their own knives. A baroness in Norfolk reportedly carried a miniature ivory carving set in her evening bag, just in case the turnips failed to inspire. One dinner party turned briefly competitive when 3 guests began carving their own centerpieces during dessert, turning the table into a quiet frenzy of peels and pride. Back at Edgeborn's chateau, the inspection is finally over. He leans back with the air of someone who has fought a mighty internal battle and decided, for tonight, to be benevolent. The kitchen will live another day. Of course, the chateau is just one of many creations in his turnip empire. Over the years, he's commissioned vegetable portraits, a musical turnip box, and once, a working sundial made from carrot sticks and the shadow of a cabbage. His peers mocked him, gently and only behind his back. His servants told stories in whispers and laughter. But all of them, every last one, took it seriously when the carving began. In truth, Edgeborn wasn't alone in his passion. Across England and into the continent, aristocrats delighted in outdoing one another with increasingly ridiculous displays. If Lady Glastonbury's table had a root vegetable tea set, then by George, Lord Harrington would one-up her with a turnip orchestra, each instrument lovingly crafted, and, if one leaned in close enough, capable of making a vague honking noise when squeezed. And let's not forget the manuals. Dozens of them, printed and handwritten, passed from kitchen to kitchen like sacred texts. The Decorative Root, a treatise on banquet embellishment, was one of the most infamous, banned briefly in 1859 for inciting what was referred to as an epidemic of excessive garnishing. No one was harmed. But a goose did wear a turnip bonnet. The thing is, you begin to understand them. These people, these absurdly rich, overdressed, underoccupied people who stared down a root vegetable and said, "Let's make this weird," because when life is all about presentation, when even your cough at the opera can imply scandal, you start reaching for creative outlets. Some chose painting. Others wrote poetry about sunsets and gout. But for a few glittering decades, the elite looked down at the dinner table and found their muse in the gnarled, pale flesh of the turnip. It helped, of course, that they didn't have to do any of the carving. That job fell to a small army of kitchen assistants, most of whom developed forearms like blacksmiths and eyesight like moles. But a few rose through the ranks, gaining reputations as root virtuosos. One man, known only as Claude, was said to be able to carve a fox from a turnip in under 4 minutes. Another, Margaret Albright of Bath, became locally famous for her uncanny ability to replicate a guest's profile using only a spoon and a sharpened cinnamon stick. You imagine Edgeborn summoning one of these artists with a solemn nod and a whisper. "Make it weep, Margaret, make it weep." And she would. Because that's what turnip art demanded. Not just skill, but emotion. As silly as it all seems, there's something deeply human in this odd pursuit. A desire to create, to surprise, to take something ordinary and make it a little bit magical, even if it melts away the moment dinner begins. So you step back once more, admiring the turnip chateau in all its temporary glory. Tomorrow it will be gone, eaten by mice, swept away by sleepy servants, or left to wilt in the corner of a forgotten scullery. But for now, in this moment, it is perfect. And that's more than most dinners can say. The turnip chateau still lingers in your mind as you meander toward the rear of the banquet hall, where the kitchen corridor sends out an occasional gust of warm, herb-scented air. The ballroom continues to hum with soft laughter, tinkling glasses, and the faint shuffle of overstarched servants. But just beyond the heavy oak doors, far from the candlelight and corsets, the real artists toil. This, you realize, is where the turnip becomes art. You slip through a side passage into a quieter chamber, an anteroom of sorts, serving as both prep area and waiting room for sculptures. The air here smells of raw root, like earth soaked in rain. The walls are lined with narrow tables, each crowded with paring knives, carving hooks, and silver instruments that wouldn't look out of place in a surgeon's kit. At the center, a workbench stained with beet juice and ambition. This is the domain of the food sculptors, the unsung artisans of 19th century banquets. While the nobility toast their turnip towers, these quiet hands bring them into being. At one station, a middle-aged chef leans over a particularly stubborn snowball turnip, tongue poking from the corner of her mouth in deep concentration. Her name might be Elsie, or Nan, or something equally comforting. Her fingers move with mechanical elegance, no wasted motion, as she shaves away slivers to form a delicate peacock. The feathers are fanned out using paper-thin strips, held aloft by gelatin scaffolding. It won't last, but it only needs to hold through dessert. In another corner, a young apprentice, no older than 16, squints over his practice piece. It's supposed to be a lion, though at this stage it's more of a confused sheep. He sighs, mutters something in Welsh, and begins again. The carving floor is where dreams are honed, then trimmed, then discarded altogether. And this isn't just guesswork. There are rules, serious ones. Whole apprenticeship programs developed around food carving in large estate kitchens. Some required knowledge of botany. Others insisted on mastery of shading, learned by manipulating light across the curved surfaces of waxed turnip flesh. Historians still argue whether these culinary sculptors were ever considered artists in their own time, or merely skilled labor. While the nobility applauded the finished pieces, few thought to thank the person behind the parsnip owl. Recipes from the period often included vague instructions like, instruct your cook to present the swan as usual, as if the swan just arrived. In this room, though, the artistry is palpable. You run your eyes over a shelf of finished pieces waiting to be brought out. Turnip cherubs, carrot harps, beet-stained roses. One is a miniature banquet scene, with even smaller vegetables carved into tiny guests. Someone has humorously included a turnip version of Lord Edgeborne, with exaggerated eyebrows and a judgmental posture. It's tucked discreetly behind a tray of radish fans, likely to be seen only by the staff. You lean closer to the tool table, examining a curious instrument shaped like a flattened thimble with a single hooked blade. It's used to curl turnip edges into ribbons, giving them a ruffled texture like a Regency collar. Another tool resembles a melon baller, but with triangular blades, for petal work, you assume. These tools are passed down, borrowed, sometimes stolen. More than one kitchen rivalry has flared over a missing peeler or dulled carving knife. One popular manual from the 1850s, the Decorative Cook's Companion, even had full-page diagrams of these tools, though it sternly warned that a tool in the wrong hand is as dangerous as fire in a pantry. Dramatic? Yes. But if you've ever seen a novice gouge through a 2-hour swan and turn it into a lumpy turnip blob, you'd understand. But what of the failures? You step quietly into a narrow room adjoining the carving hall, cold, dim, and quiet. Here lie the rejects, the chipped, the cracked, the turnips whose curves betrayed them. There's a certain reverence in the way they've been discarded, neatly lined up, not thrown. A soft graveyard of effort. You pause by one, a half-finished cherub with a cracked torso and missing wing. Even in its incompleteness, there's beauty. A ghost of what could have been. In the corner, a pile of turnip peels curls and coils like wood shavings. They're not wasted, of course. Many kitchens would dry and reuse them as kindling, or feed them to livestock. But in this room, they feel like something more. Like confetti after a performance. Applause in root form. Not all chefs were equal, naturally. In the grand houses of London, Paris, and Vienna, the most skilled were known by name, whispered through sculleries and gossiped about in markets. One famed Austrian carver, Johann Gruber, could reportedly create a full floral bouquet from a single root. Another, called simply Martha of Montpellier, specialized in vegetable birds with moving wings, achieved through finely carved hinges and threads soaked in broth to stiffen them. You imagine the pressure. A noble family waiting, impatient, at the table. The footman tapping his heel. The lady of the house checking her reflection in the soup spoon. And you, in a hot kitchen, desperately trying to keep a beetroot elephant from slumping sideways under the weight of its own absurdity. And yet, they did it. Night after night. Feast after feast. Turnip after turnip. You return to the main carving room just in time to witness a final flourish. The older carver, Elsie, adds a sprig of parsley to the peacock's beak. She steps back, nods. The assistant carefully lifts the tray and vanishes into the banquet hall, swallowed by chandeliers and expectation. You remain for a moment in the quiet. The carving floor is calm now. The chaos has passed. What remains is a strange peace. the kind that comes from creation, from transmuting the plain into the extraordinary, even if only for a single evening. You run a hand across the edge of the workbench. Smooth wood, damp turnip shavings, a faint trace of time. It's not glamorous, it's not honored, but it is real. And somewhere, out in the ballroom, a guest is gasping softly at a vegetable bird. The scent of time still clings to your memory as you drift back into the banquet hall. Though now the room seems to glow a little warmer, a little deeper. Candles have been replaced, soup courses have come and gone, and the air is thick with roast drippings and rose water. But the centerpieces, those curious gleaming turnip arrangements, remain untouched, proud, and peculiar as ever. You find yourself drawn toward one of the side tables now, where something particularly unusual is catching the eyes of curious guests. It's not the size of the sculpture that stuns you, though it is impressive, but the movement. Yes, movement. A spinning turnip display. At the heart of it, a delicate wooden crank, cleverly disguised as part of the serving platform, allows a footman to gently rotate the entire piece. Carved vines twist upward, turnip leaves flutter in carved curves, and at the very top, a pair of turnip cherubs seem to twirl in an eternal waltz. It's hypnotic, if slightly absurd, and you can't help but marvel at the engineering. Here is where root artistry turns mechanical. While the idea of a rotating vegetable arrangement might feel like the fever dream of a particularly caffeinated butler, it was not entirely unheard of. In the 1850s, certain estates began experimenting with what was called kinetic garnishing. These weren't just still lifes, they were animated scenes, designed to gently impress, then promptly wilt. Historians still argue whether the trend was inspired by clockwork automatons or by a famous incident at a royal banquet in Prussia, where a rotating centerpiece collapsed and flung a beet swan into a duchess's lap. Either way, the brief era of spinning vegetables was real and wildly impractical. You lean closer. The craftsmanship is astonishing. The platform spins smoothly, likely lubricated with clarified butter. A spiral of carved parsnips forms the base. Slivers of pink-stained turnip, delicate as petals, flutter with every rotation, giving the illusion of blooming flowers. The effect is subtle and quietly delightful. It's the kind of detail a bored noble might barely register, but a kitchen servant would remember forever. You imagine the instructions sent ahead of time. Ensure the dais rotates no faster than a Sunday waltz, no more than 2 cherubs. Keep the beats stationary. We remember the incident. Even more remarkable is the turnip music box that accompanies it, if music box is the right word. Beneath the sculpture, a tiny mechanism powered by a wound spring plays a series of soft chimes each time the display makes a full rotation. It's not a melody, exactly. More like a delicate reminder that someone, somewhere, put far too much effort into a vegetable. And perhaps that's what makes it so oddly charming. The excess, the devotion, the sheer impracticality. A guest near you murmurs, "Imagine the hours," before sipping their wine and forgetting the whole thing. But you don't forget. Because behind every whimsical spin of a turnip petal lies the hand of someone who sat with it for hours, shaving, carving, adjusting, breathing life into a root that will be compost tomorrow. Another turning display farther down the hall depicts a carousel. Tiny horses carved from turnips and potatoes ride in slow, solemn circles. There's even a small figure of Queen Victoria, perched regally atop a beet pony. This particular display, you're told, was created by a visiting French chef as a satirical piece. It was meant to lampoon the dizzying nature of English nobility's obsession with appearances. It didn't work. The host loved it. The guests applauded, and the satire promptly became trend. These days, you might be tempted to call it extra or perhaps unhinged. But in its time, this was prestige. Turning turnips into ballet dancers, dinner into theater. It wasn't just about taste. It was about proving you had the kind of wealth and staff to make food that didn't even need to be eaten. You walk around the display slowly, observing how the wax polish catches the light, how the shadows shift across the peacock's plumage. Someone has added a sprig of lavender near the base, perhaps to mask the earthy scent of aging root. A nice touch. These were, after all, designed to be endured for several hours without wilting into soggy sadness, but not every kinetic sculpture survived its debut. One written account from an 1861 banquet in Dublin describes a scene where a turnip Ferris wheel, yes, Ferris wheel, malfunctioned mid-spin and launched a radish gondola into the soup course. Another featured a rotating turnip sun, which melted under candle heat and collapsed in a quiet, tragic spiral. That event was commemorated, somewhat sarcastically, in an anonymous limerick that ends, "The sun did fall to mild dismay and landed in the consommé." Still, the ambition persisted. You glance toward the serving staff, who keep a careful eye on the crank. Too many rotations could unsettle the platform. Too few, and the magic fades. It's a delicate balance, just like the whole business of aristocratic dining. Pretend you don't care. Care immensely. And the sculptors? They knew this. In fact, one popular guidebook advised chefs to insert movement into a tableau only if the guests possess the patience to notice. That's a high bar. Essentially, create ephemeral kinetic root art for people who will ignore it, which they often did. But that wasn't the point, was it? The point was the effort. The perfection of a spin. The fleeting delight of seeing a parsnip dove turn gently toward you and then away. In a world of rigid social rules and stiff brocade collars, a spinning turnip might be the closest thing to freedom on the menu. So you stay just a little longer, letting the sculpture turn. The peacock rounds again, its beak tilting toward you like a nod of acknowledgement. The music box chimes, a soft, silly tinkle. Somewhere across the hall, a guest yawns behind a lace fan. The moment fades. But you remember, and you smile, because someone made this, for no other reason than they could. The peacock continues its slow, proud turn behind you, but you've already drifted farther down the grand hall, past silver trays heaped with candied figs, and past guests who've grown bored of conversing and begun silently judging each other's lapel widths. There's a pleasant hush now, a lull between courses, when minds wander and eyes settle on the decorations that somehow haven't collapsed yet. It's the perfect time to observe what's quietly winning the admiration of the room. Symmetry. Yes, tonight's next marvel is less about movement and more about balance. An entire table-length display, 30 feet, give or take, has been constructed with mathematical precision, and at its heart, a carefully mirrored arrangement of carved turnips, mirrored so perfectly on either side of the central roast goose that if you sneezed too hard, the whole visual illusion might unravel. This is the golden age of geometric vegetable layouts, a trend that exploded in the 1840s when banquet aesthetics shifted from chaotic splendor to structured opulence. The rule became clear: if it wasn't symmetrical, it wasn't serious. And so kitchens were transformed into geometry labs. Carvers studied not only root curvature, but spatial harmony, angles, alignment. One chef, a Mr. Haversham of Bath, was said to have refused to serve a soup course unless the parsley garnish mirrored the floating croutons in exactly opposing quadrants. The mirrored turnip display in front of you is divided into 7 repeated segments, each its own tiny sculpture, identical in scale and placement. You lean closer. The first segment is a turnip lotus, carved to resemble a full bloom. The second, a vertical fan of parsnip slivers, flanked by radish rosettes. Then a beet turnip tower, tinted pale rose, perhaps with elderberry juice. And on it goes, the sequence repeating precisely down the line. The level of detail is maddening. A single misplaced petal would send the symmetry crumbling like a poorly set souffle. It's both beautiful and terrifying, like a cathedral made of sugar cubes during monsoon season. You wonder who built it, who knelt over this table for hours, maybe days, lining up every sliver and spiral, measuring by thumb and instinct. You imagine the kitchen quiet as the final parsley sprig was placed, breath held, then released when the head chef nodded. Success. The symmetry had been achieved. Not everyone appreciated the rigor. Some guests found symmetrical layouts cold, too rigid, too clinical. One noblewoman was quoted in her diary as saying, "It's like dining with a protractor." And yet the trend persisted, because nothing impressed like control. Control over chaos, over vegetables, over aesthetics and appetite alike. Historians still argue whether this style was driven by the chef's egos or the host's neuroses. Was it an artistic statement? Or a desperate cry for order in an era of cholera and crumbling empires? As always, yes, you take a step back and look again. The symmetry is soothing, like an ink blot for the stomach. You start to feel the appeal, not just in the aesthetic, but in the ritual. The comforting idea that, here at least, everything is in its proper place. Each segment has a visual rhythm. A carved turnip, a sprig of thyme, a curled leaf, a floral motif. Rinse and repeat. It's like a lullaby in root form, predictable, reassuring, the opposite of modern art, which often wants to confront you. This wants to lull you, to gently hold your hand and whisper, "Look, even the turnips are behaving." The symmetry trend even crept into the etiquette of how one was expected to eat. Some guests, following the lead of overambitious manuals, began mimicking the symmetry in their own consumption, eating from left to right, cutting each bite to match its counterpart. One poor fellow reportedly made it through only the first course before collapsing from sheer tension. They blamed the wine. But the turnips knew better. You chuckle quietly and move on, but not before noticing one segment that isn't quite right, just slightly off. A carved beet curl placed a fraction of an inch too far to the left. You wouldn't have noticed had you not been standing so close, but now it haunts you a little. A tiny rebellion? Was it a mistake? Or a private joke? A kitchen assistant testing fate? You'll never know, but you feel oddly proud of them. It's easy to forget, surrounded by these precise arrangements, that symmetry like this isn't natural. Vegetables grow crooked. They split, bulge, twist toward the sun. Nature prefers chaos. So every segment of this display is a triumph, not just of art, but of taming wildness. Each turnip had to be chosen, shaped, coaxed into conformity. A strange metaphor for aristocracy, if you're feeling generous. Of course, this obsession with perfect symmetry had its limits. A French satire from 1848 lampooned a noble's banquet, where even the soup bubbles were expected to rise in pairs. The cartoon depicted a frazzled chef skewering bubbles mid-boil with a compass. The joke landed a bit too hard and was promptly banned. But the trend lived on, at least through the end of the century, before being overtaken by more rustic styles. Farmhouse chic, you might call it. But for this golden stretch, symmetry was king, and the turnip, humble and obliging, was its most loyal subject. You glance once more down the perfectly mirrored table. The room blurs just slightly in the candlelight. Everything aligns. Everything breathes in rhythm. And though you know the vegetables will wilt by morning, tonight they stand proud in their order. As if to say, yes, we are roots, but we are roots with discipline. And that's oddly comforting. By now, your mind has adjusted to the idea that turnips might just be the most meticulously curated objects in the room. It's no longer surprising to see a root vegetable treated with more reverence than a foreign diplomat. What does surprise you, however, is the quiet little display tucked into the farthest corner of the banquet hall, past the chandeliers, beyond the mirrored symmetry, beside a slouching ficus someone forgot to water. Here, the tone shifts. There's no rotating platform, no gilded frame, no symmetrical precision. Instead, you find something far more intimate. Miniature still lifes made of vegetables, styled to mimic the classic paintings of the Dutch Golden Age. Yes, tonight the turnip has gone fine art. You crouch down just slightly, gazing into one of these arrangements. A half-peeled turnip lies on its side like a lounging goddess. A shard of beet glows deep red beneath candlelight, and a curled parsnip peel drapes itself across the corner like discarded lace. The whole thing is set against a black velvet backdrop, with 2 stubby carrots standing in as candle stubs. A final touch? A single sprig of thyme placed just so, as if to say, this was never meant to be eaten. It's quiet, poetic even, and just the slightest bit absurd. Still life arrangements like this became popular during the mid-19th century, when culinary artists began borrowing more overtly from visual art traditions. Some chefs were trained painters or sculptors who found their way into the kitchens of wealthy homes, where their talents could be repurposed into a more digestible medium, literally. Others were just bored, but all of them were drawn to the romance of still life. And really, it makes sense. Turnips had the right texture for dramatic lighting. Their pale skin picked up shadows with subtlety, and their shape, bulbous but soft, lent itself to those moody, brooding compositions that Dutch painters loved so much. Add a broken bread roll and a slightly wrinkled grape, and you've got a banquet masterpiece masquerading as melancholy. One well-documented example came from the home of Lady Wexbridge, who once hosted an entire dinner themed around the fleetingness of root. Guests entered through a tunnel of draped curtains into a candle-lit chamber, where every surface bore a still life tableau. Each one was edible, technically, but none were meant to be touched. Historians still argue whether Lady Wexbridge was a visionary or simply having a very complicated emotional month. Tonight's still lifes feel more grounded, more tender. One of them, a particularly lovely composition, features a half-carved turnip set next to a single melting pat of butter. A sliver of radish suggests a bitten lip. There's something eerily human in it, like the vegetables have secrets. You almost expect them to speak, quietly, with accents. And then there's the lighting. That might be the best part. Candlelight, angled through cut glass, casts dramatic shadows across the velvet. One display even has a backdrop painted to look like a faded window, giving the illusion that the vegetables are resting on a sill somewhere in Delft, contemplating mortality. Or perhaps just over-salted soup. You remember a quote you once read, attributed to a kitchen apprentice named Jean, who said, "A good still life should make you feel like something just happened. A better one makes you feel like something is about to." Jean later eloped with a pastry sculptor, which seems very on-brand. At the base of each arrangement is a small placard, handwritten in flourished script. Titles include "Root Contemplates Itself," "Turnip with Regret," and "Evening Before the Stew." They're tongue-in-cheek, certainly, but they carry a kind of strange dignity. As if the chef is saying, "Yes, I know this is nonsense, but it is beautiful nonsense." You find yourself standing longer than you expected. There's a softness here, in the quiet artfulness, that the grander displays lack. The spinning peacock was impressive. The symmetrical banquet was clinical. But this is vulnerable, imperfect, gently humorous. A sigh in vegetable form. Of course, not everyone in the 19th century was a fan. Some critics dismissed still life arrangements as overly sentimental. One London magazine accused the trend of encouraging turnip melancholy among the working classes. Another article warned that overwrought vegetable scenes risk dissuading diners from practical appetites. Imagine being too emotionally moved by a radish to eat your entree. Yet for many, that was the point. These weren't dishes. They were moments, pauses. A way to say, here is a root. It lived underground. Now it rests on velvet, bathed in candlelight. Consider it. And so you do. One final tableau catches your eye. It's simpler than the others. A single turnip, whole and uncut, placed at the center of an otherwise empty plate. A folded napkin lies beside it. Nothing else. No garnish, no backdrop. Just the turnip, lit from the side in such a way that it casts a perfect oval shadow. Like the moon, but edible. It doesn't have a title placard. You decide to name it yourself. Silence, because sometimes, even in a room full of chatter and clinking and spinning bird sculptures, the quietest root says the most. You linger a little longer by the still life display, half expecting one of the turnips to blink at you with weary existentialism. But they don't. They just sit there, solemn and proud, illuminated like saints in a stained glass chapel made of cutlery and compromise. You eventually tiptoe away, careful not to disturb the atmosphere, and make your way toward the refreshment alcove, where things are decidedly less serious. Because here, dear guest, is where the turnip gets playful. Yes, not all 19th century banquet displays were solemn meditations on vegetable mortality. Some were, quite simply, ridiculous, and proud of it. You find yourself drawn to a collection of edible novelties known affectionately in their time as jests of the root. They were the conversation starters, the icebreakers, the things that made a baroness spit tea into her gloves. Equal parts whimsy and craftsmanship. These little visual jokes took the humble turnip and turned it into a punchline, with a surprisingly elegant setup. Take, for example, the turnip gentleman. Perched atop a serving trolley, this rotund fellow wears a monocle made of cucumber peel, a cravat of spring onion, and carries a cane fashioned from a licorice root. He's slightly bow-legged, on purpose, and balanced with such precision that one gentle poke sends him rocking back and forth on his beetroot shoes. Guests adore him. He is, by all accounts, the life of the dinner party, or at least the most amusing part of the appetizer course. The tradition of edible jesters dates back even earlier than the 1800s, but it truly flourished during this century's later decades when banquets grew larger, longer, and increasingly prone to boredom. Aristocrats with too many forks and not enough laughter demanded amusements between courses. Enter Turnip Comedy. The star of tonight's comedic spread is a series of vegetable portraits, lining the far wall like a gallery, each more absurd than the last. One depicts the host himself, his cheeks exaggerated in beet pulp, and his eyebrows replaced with thick fennel fronds. Another shows a rival estate's hunting dog, reimagined in daikon and olive pips. A third, a true masterpiece, portrays Queen Victoria herself, entirely in roots, with a boiled potato tiara and a turnip expression that conveys both mild judgment and deep digestion. The guests pretend not to laugh. But they do. Historians still argue whether such displays were sanctioned by the nobility or merely tolerated under the guise of culinary innovation. Some think these vegetable caricatures were a cheeky act of rebellion by the kitchen staff, artistic pranks hidden in plain sight. Others believe the hosts enjoyed them as private jokes, ways to subtly insult neighbors without ever raising their voices. Of course, not all jokes landed well. A notorious 1873 banquet in Cornwall featured a turnip depiction of a local bishop, complete with mutton chop radish sideburns and a celery crozier, which caused a minor scandal when the bishop's niece took offense. She flung a bread roll in protest, which struck the caricature squarely in the face, knocking its parsnip nose askew. The moment was recorded in 3 separate journals, 1 poem, and an anonymously illustrated pamphlet entitled The Bishop and the Bun. But even with the occasional misstep, the trend persisted. You study one of the smaller jest displays now, a scene of vegetable animals cavorting across a biscuit meadow. There's a turnip cow, complete with beetroot spots, a daikon goose with radish feet, and, best of all, a rutabaga pig lounging in a puddle of gravy. A placard nearby reads, "Pastoral scene, as imagined by the undercook. The humor is gentle." Silly, yes, but never cruel. These aren't mocking displays. They're winks. Inside jokes shared between the kitchen and the curious. An invitation to lighten up, even just for a moment, between the oppressive gravitas of pate and politics. And the materials? Surprisingly complex. The best jests required as much skill as the grand sculptures. Jiggling carrot eyes, mustaches made from dried leek fiber, eyebrows of toasted turnip skin. Everything had to hold together under heat, humidity, and the trembling gaze of bored aristocrats. A single misplaced olive could ruin the joke. Timing was everything. Like comedy always is. You imagine the kitchen crew snickering quietly as the trays are carried out. You imagine the youngest apprentice, red-cheeked and flour-smudged, holding their breath as the turnip gentleman makes his wobbling debut. You imagine the subtle nod of approval from the head chef when a duchess chortles behind her lace fan. There's power in that. A different kind of power than symmetry or spinning sculptures. This is the kind of power that says, "We see you, you ridiculous people with your embroidered cravats and complaints about pheasant temperature. We know you want to laugh. Let us give you permission." And so, for one shimmering hour, the vegetables play. Later, of course, they'll be cleared away. The jesters dismantled, the caricatures composted, the gravy meadow scrubbed from its tray. But the laughter remains. A memory embedded in the tablecloth, in the smudge of beet juice on a cufflink, in the servant's faint smirk as he retires to the scullery. Because deep down, even amid the powdered wigs and ceremonial forks, people still crave a little silliness. And sometimes it comes with a turnip smile. The sound of distant laughter fades as you make your way from the jester's gallery, past another shimmering row of crystal flutes, and into a smaller salon attached to the main banquet chamber. It's quieter here, calmer. The candlelight is softer, flickering gently across velvet drapes and oil paintings of ancestors who would certainly disapprove of turnip pigs, but eat them anyway out of politeness. This room houses a more contemplative kind of tribute. It is, in its own way, a museum of forgotten customs, featuring edible centerpieces based not on visual spectacle or satire, but on the habits and pastimes of daily 19th century life. And central to it all is an extraordinary curiosity. The turnip tea tableau. You blink, and blink again. Because, yes, before you is a full Victorian tea scene, completely fashioned from root vegetables. There's a delicate tea set carved from snowball turnips, complete with hollowed cups and a tiny teapot with a handle made of braided leek stem. The teacups are filled, not with actual tea, but with gelatin tinted to resemble Earl Grey, perhaps lavender infused. You lean closer. There's even a paper-thin lemon slice floating on top, made from parsnip and a brush of turmeric for that yellow hue. And yes, of course, there's a vegetable guest seated at the table. A dainty lady sculpted from 2 stacked turnips, with radish earrings and a cabbage bonnet, forever mid-sip. Her companion, a gentlemanly figure made from a particularly lumpy yam, sits slightly hunched as though he's just told a joke, and is hoping it landed. Their table is flanked by carved cucumber chairs and a rug fashioned from beetroot skin, pressed and painted in crosshatch for that authentic parlor look. You have to hand it to the carvers. This isn't just charming, it's eerie in its accuracy. Even the sugar cubes are present, and a miniature copy of the Times rests beside the lady's hand, printed painstakingly onto a napkin in ink, made from squid and charcoal. It's all very precise. This, you realize, is more than an amusing scene. It's an edible time capsule, a recreation of a specific moment in bourgeois domestic life, reimagined in produce, somewhere between loving tribute and social commentary. Historians still argue whether these scenes were meant to honor daily rituals or to gently mock them. After all, who needs a root vegetable reenactment of Aunt Mildred's Tuesday tea? But it's clear that these displays had a quiet, cultural purpose. They recorded the rituals of the time in a medium far more biodegradable than parchment or paint. And the trend wasn't limited to tea. Elsewhere in the room, another scene. A 19th century writing desk. The desk itself is a plank of parsnip, carefully sanded with drawer handles made of licorice root knobs. An open journal sits atop it, its pages crafted from blanched potato slices, thin and curled, the ink scribbled in tidy lines. A turnip inkwell and quill completes the scene. Beside it, a tiny scene of laundry day. A string of carved radish stockings hangs between two celery stalks, clothes pinned with parsley stems. A doll-like figure, a servant presumably, stands nearby with a beet bucket and a carved carrot mop. The laundry is soaking in what looks like a shallow pool of onion broth set in a carved rutabaga basin. It is somehow adorable. And so, this trend, known then as domestic tableau, became its own minor movement in high society. Between 1850 and 1870, it became fashionable among the aristocracy to commission edible scenes from their own lives, reconstructed by kitchen artists with unsettling fidelity. A sort of humble brag, perhaps. "Look how charmingly ordinary we are," they seemed to say, while paying 6 florins for someone to carve a pipe from celeriac. One wealthy widow reportedly had an entire dinner made to resemble a day in her garden. Her morning tea, her dogs lounging, a footman presenting her hat. The table was shaped like her veranda. The guests were instructed to admire, but not eat. Several of them did anyway. You pause by a particularly delicate piece. A baby's cradle carved from squash, lined with spun sugar lace. Inside, a parsnip infant swaddled in cabbage leaves sleeps forever under a carrot canopy. The detail is astonishing. Tiny nostrils, soft root cheeks, even a wisp of hair carved into its crown. A nearby note reads, "To commemorate Lady Thistleton's 6th grandchild, and the christening cake he could not eat." Even now, this tableau feels tender. Silly, sure, but also deeply human. These scenes capture not just activities, but moments of affection, nostalgia, and care, frozen in time and starch. There was even an annual contest held in parts of rural Sussex called The Day in Turnips, where estate kitchens submitted full table recreations of daily life. One winner featured an entire fox hunt, including riders, hounds, and one disapproving magistrate sculpted from an unusually snobbish-looking carrot. Another, more controversial, depicted a boardroom meeting with vegetable bankers and a lone parsnip accountant sweating visibly under radish spotlights. Critics called the trend decadent, wasteful. But what's really more wasteful? Carving a dinner into a fleeting sculpture, or never using your food for joy at all? You run your finger gently along the edge of the turnip teacup. It's smooth, cooler than the air around it. And in this soft light, surrounded by edible versions of someone's very regular life, you feel something settle inside you. A kind of peace, an invitation to slow down, to notice the little rituals, to sit like the root lady with a warm cup in your hand and nothing pressing to do but sip and think, and maybe laugh a little, because this is still a vegetable, pretending to be a duchess. Somewhere between the parsnip cradle and the rutabaga desk, you begin to sense a shift in the air. Not in the temperature, still pleasantly warm from candles and the gentle hum of chafing dishes, but in the mood. There's a kind of reverence settling now, soft as a linen napkin folding into your lap. You follow it, letting your gaze and your feet carry you deeper into the banquet space until you arrive at what might be the most quietly astonishing part of the evening. The seasonal turnip altar. Yes, altar, for while root vegetables had been sliced, stacked, spun, and satirized across the grand traditions of 19th century banquet art, there remained one particular tradition that fused aesthetic devotion with something approaching actual devotion. These seasonal altars, often displayed during harvest feasts, were more than just decorative. They were symbolic, almost sacred. And tonight's example, standing tall at the far end of the hall beneath an arched window, is a breathtaking study in earth tones and quiet power. It stands over 6 feet tall, constructed from a wide pyramidal base of densely packed vegetables, mostly turnips, of course, but also rutabagas, salsify, and Jerusalem artichokes, chosen not just for their shape, but for the harmony of their hues. The lower tiers are broad, stacked like altar steps, covered in small carved motifs, sheaves of grain, sunbursts, tiny doves. You lean closer. One dove has eyes made of black mustard seeds. Another clutches a sprig of rosemary in its beak. Someone, somewhere, decided that mattered. At the top, a large, gleaming white turnip has been polished to a near porcelain finish. It rests on a bed of golden straw, slightly elevated, cradled by 2 small carved hands. This is the harvest root, the centerpiece of the altar, meant to represent both abundance and humility, a symbol of the good earth and those who draw their sustenance from it. Like a reliquary, but starchier, you stand in silence for a while. It's hard to describe why it's so moving. Perhaps because it feels so out of place next to the swirling jesters and grinning root caricatures. There's no irony here, no wink, just a deep, slow homage to the rhythm of the seasons, to planting and waiting, to things that grow in the dark. Historians still argue whether these altars were born of rural folk customs or aristocratic romanticism. Some claim they originated in Saxon harvest rites, where root vegetables were offered to deities of the field. Others say they were purely decorative inventions by bored estate designers, hoping to impress guests with a taste for pastoral nostalgia. Either way, their purpose endured. A reminder, amid the silver platters and French wine, that everything on the table came, at least in theory, from the soil. A small handwritten card at the altar's base reads simply, "Gathered with care, carved in thanks." It's not hard to imagine the ceremony that might have accompanied this display in its heyday. The head gardener delivering the largest turnip of the season with quiet pride. The underchef selecting its position, adjusting the straw for symmetry. The guests murmuring their approval, even as they inwardly hoped the speeches wouldn't delay dessert. One 1865 account from a Yorkshire manor describes how the harvest altar was carried into the dining room by torchlight, accompanied by a soft fiddle tune and the scent of rosemary. The turnip was lifted ceremoniously onto its dais by the eldest gardener and a child from the village, an intentionally symbolic pairing meant to represent wisdom and innocence. The moment was considered the spiritual high point of the evening, even if it was promptly followed by a cheese course and light gossip. You step back now and admire the full shape of the altar. It's not symmetrical like the earlier displays, nor is it theatrical. It's organic, layered, purposeful. Here, imperfections are embraced. The slightly cracked skin of a root, the odd knot in a carrot stem, the way one parsnip leans gently into its neighbor like they've been standing together all season. And around the base of the structure, tiny offerings. You hadn't noticed them at first, but now they glimmer faintly in the low light. A honeycomb tucked between two radishes, a ring of dried apple slices, a folded note secured with twine. Someone has placed a small copper button near the rosemary dove, and beside it, a child's drawing, smudged, folded, possibly forgotten. Whether these were part of the original design or added spontaneously by guests is unclear, but they lend the altar a kind of softness, a communal memory. You wonder what would happen if you added something yourself. A nod of respect, a little nonsense in a night already filled with serious flourishes. So, reaching into your coat pocket, you pull out a sugar cube, the sort you were saving for tea, and gently set it at the edge of the straw platform. The altar doesn't glow, no trumpets sound, but something in the room feels right. And perhaps that's the quiet miracle of these displays, that amid all the artifice and extravagance, there are moments of honest connection between guests and food, between hosts and harvests, between one turnip and the next. As you step away, the candles behind the altar flicker slightly in the window's draft, casting long shadows across the floorboards. The harvest root seems to glow just faintly, though perhaps that's the candle wax catching in its carved ridges. You leave the room slowly, one foot gently after the other, reminded that even in a world of gold-rimmed absurdity, something as humble as a turnip can carry the weight of gratitude, history, and beauty. All it needs is the right pedestal. You exit the hush of the harvest altar room with a softness in your step, as though carrying the residue of reverence on the soles of your shoes. The banquet resumes around you, voices drifting, forks clinking, a piano playing something that can only be described as aristocratic meandering. But your eyes are drawn next to a strange little corridor just off the main dining space, dimly lit and lined with glass display cases. What you've discovered is not technically part of the evening's feast. It's more of an archive, a collection, a curated walk through time, dedicated entirely to the forgotten tools, molds, and gizmos that made the era's turnip artistry possible. Welcome, dear sleeper, to the Hall of Utensils. At first glance, it's not impressive. A collection of oddly shaped knives, tongs, and presses, some rusted, some gleaming. But the longer you look, the more curious it becomes. Every strange implement in these cases served a very particular, and often hilariously niche, purpose in the golden age of decorative food. Take, for instance, the turnip curling iron, patented in 1842 by a Mr. Percival Lanchester. The device resembles a modern curling wand, but with a crank and a set of grooved teeth. Its purpose? To create elegant spirals from turnip peel, meant to hang like decorative fringe along the rims of punch bowls or meat platters. It was said to produce a lace of root most pleasing to the eye, if not to the palate. Beside it, a display of vegetable impression plates. These brass molds were used to stamp patterns into the surface of boiled turnips, roses, anchors, crowns, even family crests. Guests could identify their place settings by the root embossed with their sigil. You imagine the kitchen staff rolling their eyes as they pressed yet another griffin into a turnip for some minor duke with a fondness for heraldry. A small placard reads, "The crest of the Marquis of Blackmere. Never once noticed, always requested." Then there's the oddly menacing radish guillotine, a miniature slicing tool designed to create perfectly even medallions of radish or young turnip. Its blade was famously sharp, and its owner famously clumsy. One anecdote notes that a chef in Wiltshire nicked his fingertip, bandaged it, and continued carving, only to discover later he had also accidentally julienned a piece of his glove into a guest's salad. The guest, being terribly British, said nothing. Historians still argue whether the proliferation of these tools was driven by necessity or by a competitive culinary arms race. Did chefs truly need a turnip rosette punch in 6 sizes, or were they simply trying to outdo the neighboring estate? Some records describe kitchen drawers overflowing with single-use implements, like the miniature spade for delicately shaving turnip petals and the hilariously specific salsify slicer. There's even a wall of practice turnips. These are wooden or wax replicas that apprentice chefs used to hone their skills without wasting produce. A few bear deep gouges from the trembling hands of beginners. Others display elegant slices, tidy spirals, and in one case, a rather confident attempt at a cherub's foot. You stop in front of a particular tool, a slender, curved blade with a filigreed ivory handle and a handwritten tag that reads, Chef Tournel's favorite, never loaned, always locked. Legend has it that Tournel, a celebrated root carver of the 1860s, once dismissed a kitchen assistant for using this blade without permission. The assistant retaliated by shaving the words, "Nice turnip, sir," into the underside of the dinner table. It wasn't discovered until a dinner guest dropped their serviette and burst into very improper giggles. Not all inventions caught on. Displayed under soft yellow light is the infamous turnip pipe blower, a short-lived attempt at creating hollow, flute-like vegetables that could be played during dinner. They mostly produced a wet whistling sound. One nobleman referred to the invention as the most pointless root tutory in culinary memory. The concept died quietly after a test run ended with a guest inhaling a piece of beet cork and demanding reparations. But some of the tools here are truly beautiful. Intricately etched knives, with handles inlaid with mother-of-pearl, miniature tongs shaped like swans, even a set of banquet tweezers used to apply silver leaf to decorative radish wings without leaving finger marks. Holding one in your hand, you can feel the care that went into it. The idea that even food meant only to be looked at deserved precision, elegance, and respect. The collection also includes a set of kitchen diagrams, sketches from training manuals with absurdly specific guidance. All petal edges must point westward on Tuesday feasts, or the garnished goose shall be flanked by no more than 3 turnip butterflies. You wonder how many apprentices memorized these diagrams under threat of public shaming, or worse, being reassigned to soup rotation. Perhaps the most heartwarming display is tucked into the final case. A velvet-lined drawer of apprentice-made test carvings, many slightly asymmetrical, a few hilariously abstract. One particularly lopsided root figure has a plaque that reads, Gertrude's first swan, rejected by the head chef, loved by the footman. It's charmingly awful. You'd eat it out of sheer moral support. You pause, smile, and let your gaze wander across the cases one last time. There's something humbling about it all. The hundreds of hours spent slicing, trimming, molding, only to have the results admired briefly and then discarded. It speaks to a kind of beauty that's inherently fleeting, like a snowflake or a soufflé, or a particularly good joke about fennel. And yet these tools remain, quiet, gleaming, waiting for someone to remember that a turnip isn't just food. It's a canvas, a challenge, an oddly shaped whisper of the human desire to make something unnecessary, and in doing so, make something unforgettable. You step back from the glass case, still thinking about Gertrude's swan, flawed, misshapen, and somehow perfect, and make your way down a narrow hallway lined with curtains instead of paneling. The drapes are velvet, burgundy, heavy with dust and nostalgia. A small hand-painted sign above the archway ahead reads, "For guests of a curious palate." That's you, apparently. You step inside, and the scent changes. Gone is the dominant perfume of roasted meats and overambitious sauces. Here, it's subtler, earthier. Hints of cinnamon, old wood, and something vaguely mossy. You're in a room that appears to be styled after a rustic cottage kitchen, only fancier. This is where the historical recipes live, the kinds that never quite made it into common cookbooks because they were either too odd, too personal, or, in one case, legally upsetting. Tonight's feature, experimental 19th century turnip dishes, displayed on long oak tables under warm candlelight, each accompanied by a modest note card. Some lovingly handwritten, others clearly scrawled in haste between disasters. The first dish that catches your eye is titled Turnip à la Cloud. The card claims it was a dessert. Yes, dessert. Served at an 1859 garden party in Devonshire, created by a chef who was desperately trying to impress a woman with an allergy to everything but root vegetables. It's a whipped turnip mousse, apparently, sweetened with lavender sugar and flecked with candied peel. The texture is somewhere between marshmallow and mashed potato. You are both intrigued and horrified. Right beside it, turnip coffee substitute. Developed during wartime shortages and kept around longer than strictly necessary. This was made by roasting thin slices of turnip until dark and grinding them into a powder that brewed into something vaguely hot and bitter. Guests called it turnoffee. Historians called it a last resort before chewing bark. Still, someone tried to sell it commercially. You imagine the slogan, warm, brown. Probably not poison. Not far down the table, a tray of turnip candles flickers gently. These were hollowed and filled with a mixture of beeswax and turnip oil, then used to scent early kitchens. When lit, they gave off a faint vegetal aroma said to repel moths and judgmental relatives. One footnote states that a well-placed turnip candle could clear a room faster than political discourse. Next, penny turnip pies. A working-class favorite during lean seasons, these were small hand pies filled with mashed turnip, onion, and whatever else hadn't gone bad that week. They were baked directly on stone, wrapped in paper for portability, and frequently mistaken for lumps of coal when dropped. Many factory workers reportedly carried them in coat pockets, where they provided both lunch and light insulation. You reach the end of the table and find something curious. Turnip ink. That's right, ink. A purplish-black liquid made by boiling down purple-skinned turnips with iron filings and vinegar. It was occasionally used in estate kitchens to label food crates or leave scandalous notes tucked inside pies. One diary entry from a maid in Norfolk mentions a cook who used it to secretly annotate the guest list with things like Lady Clementine, Banquets will steal jam. Historians still argue whether these recipes were acts of desperation or genuine innovation. Was the turnip mousse a culinary breakthrough or a romantic misfire? Was turnip ink practical or a passive-aggressive prank medium? Some scholars say it's both. Others have stopped returning emails on the topic. And here's the most curious offering of all. A glass cloche covering a single cube, labeled turnip taffy. You read the card aloud in your head. A failed experiment in 1876 involving boiled turnip syrup, cream of tartar, and hope. Supposedly created as a tooth-friendly treat for the elderly, it instead developed a texture somewhere between rawhide and melancholy. One lord's dentures became so entangled in it that an entire dinner was delayed by 40 minutes, while staff attempted extraction with a fish fork. You smile. You can't help it. These aren't just recipes. They're stories. Each dish is a quiet monument to someone's curiosity. Someone who looked at a bland white root and thought, maybe if I boiled it in brandy and added cinnamon, it'll taste like something people won't regret. A small book rests at the end of the display. It's open to a page headed, "The Turnip That Tried." Inside are handwritten notes, some crossed out, others circled, and one with a star beside it that reads, "Try this again in a few years, maybe after a nap." You linger there, hand on the tabletop, absorbing the gentle absurdity of it all. Because while the fancy sculptures and mirrored layouts are impressive, it's these little culinary gambles that feel the most human, the most hopeful. People experimenting in the margins, stretching a root into something unexpected. Maybe you've done that too, in your own kitchen, with your own unlikely ingredients, a little bit of spice, a little too much optimism, and an end result you couldn't explain even if you wanted to. And so you walk away, slowly, with an imaginary taste of turnip mousse lingering on your tongue, and a quiet admiration for those forgotten recipe tinkerers who dared to ask, "But what if it could be sweet?" You leave the curious comfort of the recipe hall behind, though not before giving the turnip taffy one last look, as though it might wink at you. It does not. Still, there's something oddly affectionate about the whole space, as if it were built not for prestige, but for people with root-stained aprons and gentle daydreams. Now you're ushered back into the heart of the banquet hall, where things feel a touch more theatrical again. This next room is dimly lit, but not somber, more like a velvet theater waiting for a curtain to rise. And in the center, elevated on a low platform, is something not quite alive, but very determined to pretend it is. A turnip automaton. Yes, a mechanical vegetable. To be clear, this isn't some steampunk reimagining with gears and brass knobs. It's subtle, elegant, and oddly whimsical. You approach cautiously, noting the plaque nearby. The Clockwork Root, an entertaining vegetable mechanism by J. Bellamy, 1878. Already promising. The automaton is shaped like a large turnip, but its skin has been carefully smoothed and polished, lacquered to a pale ivory sheen. Small copper fixtures peek from its base, connecting it to a clockwork pedestal with discrete winding gears. And perched atop the root is a miniature dining scene. Tiny figures carved from radish, parsnip, and carrot, engaged in various delightful domestic activities. One stirs a pot. Another pours imaginary tea. A third appears to be scolding a smaller root child for tracking imaginary mud across an imaginary floor. When the crank is gently turned, by an attendant in gloves who clearly takes this very seriously, the entire mechanism hums softly to life. The dining figures begin to move. Slowly, dreamily, the tea is poured. The child slinks away. A paper-thin bell made of beet membrane dings once. There's no music, no chime, no grand reveal. Just the quiet tick-tick-tick of gears, and the ballet of carved vegetables doing their best impression of your average Thursday in 1878. Historians still argue whether the automaton was originally designed for entertainment or education. Some claim it was built as a teaching tool for children to learn table manners, an interactive dinner diorama. Others believe it was part of a much larger estate banquet, in which all courses were presented via mechanical spectacle, including a roast goose that honked and slowly turned its own spit. The latter story seems suspicious, though delightfully persistent in fringe culinary texts. This automaton, however, is very real and quietly astonishing. You notice details you missed before. The spoon stirs in a real circle. The tea actually pours via a recycled drip line inside the root. A mechanism so carefully balanced it once performed continuously for 3 hours during a 19th century ball. There's even a miniature dog under the table, tail wagging slowly, carved from a single curled parsnip and painted lightly with beet juice. The sheer labor behind this is staggering, and somehow all in service of charm. These sorts of root-based mechanical novelties became briefly fashionable during the later part of the century, particularly among the aristocracy and the burgeoning class of eccentric inventors. Known informally as dinner amusements, they ranged from spinning vegetable windmills to tiny turnip musicians that played one note each when tapped with silver forks. One particularly infamous example, a beetle-powered hors d'oeuvre carousel, involved tethering live insects to a platter mechanism. It did not last long, for obvious reasons, but the clockwork route? That one endured. Letters from guests who encountered it in its early years described being entranced by its serenity and mildly haunted, but in a cozy way. One child reportedly burst into tears, but only because the little radish dog reminded him of a deceased hamster. You watch the figures go through their motions again. There's something meditative about it. Hypnotic. A rhythm as soothing as rain on glass, or the ticking of a distant clock late at night when you're too tired to sleep, but too awake to leave your thoughts alone. Tick, stir, pour, nod, tick. And in that sleepy cadence, something deeper becomes clear. This wasn't made to impress. Not really. It was made to delight, to charm, to give someone, somewhere, a moment of pause between the roast and the regrets. A brief flicker of joy, carved from humble roots and gears, offered up like a lullaby in brass and starch. You imagine the creator, J. Bellamy, bent over his bench late into the night, tuning the tea pour to just the right drip rate, sanding the little beat chair until it wobbled just so. Perhaps he tested it first in his own parlor, lighting a single candle and watching in quiet pride as his vegetable family came to life. And now, here you are, generations later, lulled by the same sleepy ballet of carved figures and quiet mechanism. Your breath syncs with their movement. Your thoughts slow. Your smile softens. The attendant gently turns the crank one last time, bows slightly, and allows the automaton to rest. You nod in gratitude, as if thanking a performance troupe after their curtain call. Because in a way, that's exactly what it was. A play of roots, a symphony of stillness, and a very good reason to sit a little longer at the table. You drift from the automaton with a sense of quiet reverence, like you've just left a very slow-moving opera starring tubers. The turnip family continues their tiny routine behind you, endlessly polite in their mechanical rhythm. It's time, you feel, for something less intricate, less refined, a bit messier perhaps, a bit louder. And wouldn't you know, it's just around the corner. You enter a room that feels different from the others, less curated, warmer, louder, alive in a haphazard way. Here, the scent of roasting root vegetables mixes with wood smoke and something vaguely burnt. The laughter is real. There's flour on the floor. This is the domain of the kitchen staff, the behind-the-scenes heroes of the decorative turnip age. Welcome to the scullery, or rather, a lovingly recreated scullery, built for banquet goers to admire but not touch, which, of course, you do anyway. Your fingers graze a well-worn ladle. There are vegetable peelings everywhere, piled in baskets, dropped on counters, artistically draped across a cutting board like they've been posed for a still life entitled Chaos But Warm. At the heart of it all is a long pine table, scratched and stained, covered in half-finished turnip carvings. One resembles a ship, another, a cat. Several, you suspect, are meant to be something but gave up halfway through. A sign on the wall reads, "In progress. Do not critique the swan head." The swan head is, in fairness, a little wonky. You take a moment to look up. The ceiling beams are hung with dried herbs and kitchen tools. There's an open recipe book on a shelf, a smear of what may be mustard across its spine. A butter churn stands stoically in the corner. This place feels lived in, not like the pristine banquet spaces you've passed through before. This one has stories, And voices, you hear them now. Faint and fictional, of course, but no less present. The imagined chatter of kitchen workers as they prepped turnip towers, arranged carrot curls, and kept a mental ledger of who was terrible to work for and who occasionally left shillings tucked into aprons. It was here, among the pots and peels, that the real artistry happened. Not under chandeliers, but under pressure. Not with silver tools, but with calloused hands. The decorative roots you admired earlier? All of them passed through places like this, formed in warmth and chaos, before being elevated to polished dining rooms. And amid the clutter, something remarkable. The Turnip Drafting Journal. Bound in soft leather, smudged with years of use, this logbook contains sketches, measurements, and notes from real 19th century kitchen artisans. Each page shows ideas for vegetable arrangements, some completed, some abandoned halfway through with dramatic underlines and question marks. One page is entirely dedicated to the great rutabaga swan disaster, in which a centerpiece meant to resemble a graceful waterfowl instead resembled a shoe with wings and caused 3 guests to choke on laughter during soup. In the margin, someone wrote, "Do not let Nigel carve the neck again. You chuckle." Nigel clearly had his moments. Historians still argue whether kitchens like these were creative havens or chaotic labor prisons. The truth, of course, is somewhere in between. Harsh conditions and long hours coexisted with moments of unexpected artistry. And more often than not, the best ideas were born not from meticulous planning, but from accident, necessity, or pure stubborn hope. Take, for instance, the turnip spiralizer incident. A note from 1872 recounts how a kitchen apprentice accidentally sat on a mechanical slicer, bending it irreparably. In a panic, she used a soup ladle to scoop decorative curls instead, and invented a new serving style called the turnip nest. It became wildly popular. The apprentice was promoted. The broken spiralizer? Hung on the kitchen wall like a trophy. You can imagine the conversations here, too. What's the theme of this banquet? How many turnips do we have left? Has anyone seen the parsley? Does the Duchess know her portrait looks like a radish in a bonnet? The laughter that lived here wasn't cruel. It was survival. You had to laugh, or you'd cry into your aspic, especially on nights where 3 centerpieces collapsed before the first course, or someone set fire to a potato peacock. In one corner of the scullery, a memory board displays notes and clippings, snippets of old menus, sketches of flamboyant dishes, and scribbled quotes from anonymous cooks. One reads, "They'll never know it's rutabaga if we tell them it's French." Another simply says, "Butter fixes everything." You pause to admire a rather touching display. A wooden rack of uniforms, neatly hung. Aprons still dusted with flour. A chef's cap stitched with the initials EM. A carving knife wrapped in cloth. It's quiet here, reverent, as if the tools themselves are resting after decades of use, now only telling stories to those who stop and listen. And as you lean against the scarred countertop, watching the imaginary steam rise from an invisible pot, you realize that this is the heartbeat of it all. Not the grand unveilings or the mirrored platters. This, the flower under the fingernails, the last-minute recarve. The way someone cared enough to try again even after the turnip angel collapsed for the 3rd time. Because every masterpiece begins here, in the mess, in the warmth, in the scullery. And maybe that's where you're meant to be, too, for just a little while longer. Surrounded by half-sketched swans, burned sugar, and the kind of quiet that comes only after a long day's making. You breathe in. The air is thick with root and memory, and just for a moment you feel completely at peace. Back in the soft golden corridors of the banquet hall, your boots make no sound on the worn wooden floor. The turnip automaton still ticks in the distance, and behind you, The imagined clatter of the scullery fades like the end of a lullaby. You've been fed curiosity, whimsy, and more root vegetable trivia than you ever thought possible. But now, you're about to encounter something truly strange. You round the corner into a darker, cooler room, a little drafty. There's a faint scent of beeswax, mildew, and, faint but unmistakable, chalk dust. The walls are lined with framed parchment and brittle newspaper clippings. Candle sconces flicker overhead. You're in what appears to be a temporary exhibit titled Debates and Disagreements, the Turnip Controversies. Yes, there were arguments about this stuff. In the center of the room sits a grand round table with chairs, empty now, but set with place cards bearing names like Sir Howard Grimble and Madame Lucette Lavandine. Historical reenactments, eccentric vegetarians, food historians with long grudges, hard to say. What is certain is that this table once bore witness to truly passionate disagreement about the decorative use of turnips. Mounted above the table is a rather dramatic painting. Two chefs in 19th century coats squaring off in a dueling stance, one armed with a paring knife, the other with a ladle. The caption beneath it reads, "The Great Garnish Dispute of 1861, and you begin to understand, slowly, hilariously, that there was genuine controversy about this, about whether turnips should be carved or arranged raw, about whether they belonged on the centerpiece at all, whether it was tasteful or terribly provincial to garnish a pheasant with spiralized roots instead of herbs." One panel reads, "The 1858 Letter War." Two rival chefs, both named Emile, corresponded aggressively in culinary journals over the appropriate diameter of a carved turnip rose. Their letters became increasingly sarcastic. Emile A. accused Emile B. of rooted arrogance. Emile B. retorted that Emile A. had the carving instincts of a brick. The letters are reprinted here. They're delightfully petty. Historians still argue whether these feuds were serious or staged for entertainment. Some suggest they were performance art, a kind of Victorian food theater. Others insist they were quite real, complete with factions, gossip, and bitter kitchen divides. One footnote even mentions a secret turnip purist society that held midnight meetings by lantern light and served nothing but peeled vegetables and spite. You stop at a display titled The Raw Root Debacle. It tells the story of a banquet in 1873, where a famous chef insisted on using raw, unpeeled turnips for a rustic aesthetic. Guests reportedly complained about the smell. One fainted. Another, Lady Rosalind Marfield, accidentally mistook the raw centerpiece for a bowl of crudité and shattered her tooth on a wax-polished rutabaga. She sued. The chef vanished from public life. Another small display case holds a half-burned parchment simply labeled The List. It appears to be a banned item catalog from a noble estate. Among the items, turnip doves, spinning radishes, turnip-based love poetry. You pause. Yes, love poetry. The adjacent panel provides the text of a poem written in 1867 titled Ode to a Root So Pale. The rhyme scheme is dubious, the metaphor is strained, but the earnestness unmatched. You read aloud under your breath, "Thou waxen bulb of modest girth, thy flavor dull, thy form no mirth. Yet when my heart was turned to dust, it was thy soup restored my trust. You are not proud to admit you feel something." A final, smaller display stands quietly in the back. It's less dramatic, more philosophical. Titled simply The Question, it reads, "When does decoration become deception? When is a root just a root, and when is it an invitation?" These are not rhetorical questions. Beneath them, visitors have scrawled their answers on little slips of paper, some dated over a century ago. When I stopped trying to impress and just served soup. When the dinner became more theater than nourishment. When someone carved my dog's likeness into a yam. Unforgivable. You linger. You reread the quotes. Somewhere behind you, a candle flickers too loudly. Someone once said that people argue most about things that don't matter, or that matter far too much, and maybe that's what you're sensing here. That beneath all the theater of the 19th century banquet table, behind the lace-carved radishes and spiral-cut swans, was a quiet battle about purpose. Was food meant to be beautiful or nourishing? Was art allowed to be edible? Were turnips allowed to be taken seriously? Probably not, but people tried, and their disagreements, documented so earnestly and absurdly, now live on not as footnotes, but as the main act in this peculiar museum of edible ambition. As you step back from the question, the words still echo in your mind, softened now into something less combative, more wistful. When is a root just a root? Maybe, when it's eaten without thought. Maybe, never. Maybe that's the point. Leaving behind the wax-polished debates and bitter turnip feuds, you step through a modest archway draped in soft muslin. The lighting shifts again. Warmer, lower, gently dappled like early morning sun filtered through linen curtains. There's a stillness here, a hush that feels reverent. You've arrived in what the placard calls the gentle gardens, how turnips grew before they danced. Here, the story slows to its roots, quite literally. No banquets, no swans, no love poetry carved into radishes. Just soil, weather, waiting. You wander into what appears to be a recreated 19th century kitchen garden, complete with raised beds, trellises, and straw-covered paths. Of course, it's indoors, and the greenery is artificial, but lovingly made. Each turnip leaf has been rendered in soft silk, each bed labeled in neat copperplate handwriting. White globe, purple top, golden ball. The varieties once so common, now quietly noble in their underappreciated names. A soft soundscape plays, birdsong, distant breeze, a clinking trowel. It's barely audible, as though the room itself wants to remind you how softly things grow. Here, you see how the turnip began its humble journey, not as centerpiece, not as muse, but as sustenance. Grown in long rows, mulched with straw, pulled up by hand. The informational signs read like poetry. Sown in cool soil by moonlight, harvested in frost for sweetness. Eaten by all, praised by few. In one corner, a series of weathered journals are displayed beneath glass. These are gardener's logs, anonymous, work-stained, filled with quiet observations. Notes like, mild winter, turnips sprouting too early. Pigeon damage again. Mrs. Ferris says she dreamed of a turnip with a man's face. That last one is circled twice. There's a photograph here too, sepia-toned, delicate. A row of gardeners standing proudly among their crops, sleeves rolled, boots caked in mud, one holding up a turnip roughly the size of a toddler. No one smiles. This is serious business. And yet, there's something quietly triumphant in the way they pose. As if to say, look at what the earth gave us. Look what we coaxed out with calluses and weather watching. Historians still argue whether these gardens were truly peaceful havens or simply another demanding limb of the estate machine. Did the gardeners find solace in the soil or exhaustion? Likely both. But these notes, these photos, they feel like whispers of pride. Of people who knew their work would feed a table they might never sit at, but still made the rows straight. You walk between the raised beds, imagining the rhythm of it. Sow, wait, weed, wait, harvest. Not every turnip made it to the silver platter. Most went to stews, to feed livestock, to sit quietly in baskets waiting for soup. But each had a moment in the dirt. Each mattered to someone. You stop at a display showing cross-sections of turnip bulbs, gently lit from within to show their texture. You've never really thought about the anatomy of a root before. The crisp white inside, the faint rings like tree growth. One is blemished, worm-bitten, another perfectly round. They're not beautiful in the obvious sense, but they feel real. Like the kind of honesty you only get when you're digging with your hands and hoping the frost holds off another week. A small bench invites you to sit. Above it, a sign reads, "Rest here. Imagine the work before the feast." So you do. You close your eyes, and the imagined garden comes to life. You're there, in wool sleeves, boots damp with morning dew, kneeling beside a bed of stubborn roots. Your hands ache from yesterday's weeding, but the sun is rising and the smell of cold earth is comforting. You tug gently. The turnip resists, of course it does, but yields with a satisfying pop. Dirt clings to its base. You wipe it gently against your trousers, hold it up to the light. It's not remarkable, but it's yours. You place it in the wicker basket beside others, some small, some split. One so bulbous it looks smug about it. The basket's heavy, but not unbearable. You stand, stretch. Hear something crack in your back that might be important. And as you turn toward the gate at the garden's edge, a faint wind carries the smell of the estate kitchen. Already awake, you open your eyes. The recreated garden is still. The silk leaves don't rustle. But you feel the memory in your bones. Because before the carving, the planning, the drama of who insulted whose beat medallion, before the artistry, there was this: quiet labor, honest yield. It's easy to forget, in a world of polish and showmanship, that food is grown, that before it's sliced into doves or curled into ribbons, it waits under dirt, absorbing rain and silence, that the earth gives slowly and sometimes grudgingly, but when it does, it gives generously. And tonight, in this softly lit room filled with silk foliage and the scent of wax and old paper, you remember that generosity, that miracle of root from seed, that promise whispered under frost. The turnip too had to begin somewhere. From the stillness of the garden, you return to the sound of footsteps. Not many, just the faint echo of heels on tile and the occasional scuffle of someone trying to walk quietly in impractical shoes. This next room is brighter, lighter, and styled with theatrical flair. Velvet drapes in jewel tones frame the walls. Chandeliers hang above long tables lined with mirrors, props, and what appear to be wigs. Yes, you've stepped into the dressing room, but not for people, for food. A painted sign above the entrance reads, "Stagecraft and Starch, the Art of Turnip Presentation." Of course, this is where you learn that, for all the carving, curling, and carefully arranged petals, none of it mattered unless the presentation was just right. This wasn't merely garnish. It was spectacle, theater, a meal as mise en scène. And the humble turnip? It had to play its part. In the center of the room, a long mirrored table displays various table settings from the 1800s. Ornate chargers, silverware with more forks than anyone needs. Napkins folded into improbable creatures. Swans, yes, but also griffins, elephants, and something that appears to be a hedgehog with a monocle. And always, at the center of each setting, a turnip arrangement, glowing under bell jars, framed by flowers, elevated on pedestals. One is carved into a bouquet of roses and dusted with powdered sugar to catch the candlelight. Another sits in a miniature boat made of zucchini, surrounded by tiny parsnip oarsmen, their faces inked in with what you sincerely hope is beet juice. A placard explains the elaborate illusion building that went into these presentations. Colored oils were brushed onto raw turnip slices to give them a ripe, sun-kissed hue. They weren't ripe. They weren't kissed by anything but a bored footman with too much rouge. A popular technique in the 1860s involved applying gelatin glaze to turnip sculptures, so they appeared glistening with the dew of the imaginary forest. Guests apparently loved this effect. One countess reportedly wept at the sight of a glistening root hair nestled in candied moss. Historians still argue whether the drama of the presentation enhanced the dining experience or simply distracted from the blandness of the food. Some culinary scholars insist that turnip theater reached absurdity in the 1880s, when a Viennese chef presented an entire dinner within a hollowed-out pumpkin, only for the dramatic lid reveal to unleash the scent of over-fermented sprouts and drive a baron's dog into a panic. Further along the display, you find mock-ups of table diagrams, banquet seating arranged not by status, but by theme. One notes: vegetable tableau, the seasons of root. Spring was represented by radish blossoms. Summer, a sculpted courgette sun. Autumn, of course, featured a massive golden turnip centerpiece. And winter? A cold dish of shaved fennel over ice, surrounded by tiny vegetable sleds. You pause in front of a particularly striking display. A reconstructed table setting titled The Hunt's Reward. It's a scene built entirely from food. Roast game birds placed on faux forest turf, little mushroom houses, a radish fox, and a single carved turnip stag, poised mid-prance on a mound of mashed potatoes. A note beside it reads, "Presented at the 1883 banquet of Sir Ellsworth Downley, who insisted his dinner begin with a story and end with port." And you realize, this was dinner as narrative. The table not just a place to eat, but a stage to perform meaning, nostalgia, even satire. That hedgehog napkin? A jab at the host's rival, whose beard bore a striking resemblance. You take a moment to sit on a velvet-upholstered bench, watching the flicker of candlelight dance across a mirrored tray of polished root vegetables. It's all slightly ridiculous, and deeply, absurdly human. We dress food like we dress ourselves, not just to cover it, but to say something, to elevate it, to disguise its ordinariness, to offer in the midst of practicality a bit of play. And the turnip, bless its bland little heart, was game for all of it. A slideshow plays quietly in one corner of the room. Black and white photos of old banquet spreads. In each one, the turnips are there if you look closely, tucked into borders, perched beside pheasants, forming little arches over bread baskets, always working, always trying, the supporting actor that never got top billing, but held up the show. One quote fades in on the screen. "The best decorations are the ones that whisper, not shout." Matilda Greenwhistle, table designer, 1874. You like that, because it feels true. Not just for turnips, but for the stories we tell, the lives we lead, the quiet beauty of details unnoticed. The way something small and strange and humble can become memorable, even lovable. You rise from the bench, walk past the glistening sculptures and perfectly arched breadsticks, and take one last look at the little beat oarsmen in their zucchini boat. One's hat is slightly askew. It feels like the most honest thing in the room. You smile and move on. You exit the mirrored room of vegetable theater and find yourself in a dimmer space now, hushed again. The drama of powdered sugar petals and beat oarsmen recedes behind you like a dream you're no longer trying to interpret. Here, the air feels heavier, warmer still. You step onto thick carpet, deep green, slightly worn in the middle. There's the faintest scent of dried flowers and something like old lemon polish. You're in a parlor now. A sign by the entryway, handwritten in looping script, reads, "Evenings with the Root, Turnips in Literature, Diaries and Letters." It is, without question, the coziest part of the tour. The room is laid out like a Victorian reading lounge. Overstuffed armchairs with creaky joints, side tables bearing teacups and faint rings from improper coasters. A fireplace that crackles gently but emits no heat. Bookshelves line the walls, each labeled by theme. Rooted metaphors, domestic diaries, fictional turnips and symbolic tubers. You didn't think you'd be reading turnip fiction today. And yet, you begin with the diaries. Glass displays show handwritten pages from the household journals of cooks, gardeners, housekeepers, and, unexpectedly, guests. One line from a gardener's 1875 log reads, "Miss Penelope took my best turnip again, said it looked like a gentleman. She kissed it. I don't ask questions anymore." Another from the diary of a maid in Kent confides, "They had me dust the swan again. No one eats it. I suspect it is the same turnip from Michaelmas." You find yourself chuckling softly, not wanting to disturb the imaginary others who might be reading nearby. There's something intimate in these notes. More than any sculpture or banquet, they reveal how the decorative turnip lived its quiet life. Always a little ridiculous, always around the edges. Next, you turn to the shelf marked Rooted Metaphors. Here, excerpts from poems, essays, and fiction. Writers of the era, it seems, couldn't resist using turnips to describe everything from lost love to moral character. One 1840s pamphlet, The Moral Root, argues that the turnip, though plain, does not pretend to be more than it is. This makes it nobler than the artichoke, which hides behind layers. You can't decide whether that's a compliment or a culinary takedown. Another line, from an anonymous love letter, "You are not the sugar plum nor the bright gooseberry, but the steady turnip of my affections." Reliable, earthy, mildly misunderstood. Historians still argue whether the use of turnip in Victorian affection was sincere or ironic. Some scholars insist it was shorthand for dependable love, rooted, nourishing, humble. Others believe it became a kind of in-joke, the vegetable you compared someone to when you couldn't decide if you adored or pitied them. There's a bound book on a side table titled The Root's Progress, a serialized novel that apparently ran in a ladies' periodical in 1882. It follows the adventures of a turnip farmer's daughter who disguises herself as a pastry chef to infiltrate the upper crust of society, only to fall in love with a man who turns out to be a disguised root vegetable inspector. You read 2 paragraphs and decide it may be the most comforting nonsense ever committed to paper. One passage reads, "She held her breath as Lord Cranley approached the buffet, praying he would not notice the uneven glaze on her turnip rose." "My dear," he murmured, lifting it to the light. "This garnish speaks of longing." You sit for a while in the reading chair by the fireplace, letting your eyes rest as the fictional flames crackle. On a nearby cushion rests a small embroidery hoop. The design? A stitched image of a turnip with the words, "Still I rise." You snort softly. In the far corner, a phonograph hums to life. A tinny voice reads from a letter dated 1869. "My dearest, I write from the cook's alcove where I've stolen a moment with the turnip sculpture you once mocked. It now bears your likeness, quite by accident, and glares at me with judgmental, rooty silence. I miss you. The feast is tonight. I wish you'd come. Affectionately, R." You sigh, the way you do when a story ends, and you're not sure what's real anymore. These voices, playful, wistful, earthy, are as much a part of the banquet as any carved dish. These were the people who lived beside the turnips, who gave them names, wrote them into poems, and loved them enough to make them part of the furniture of memory. You rise slowly. The carpet muffles your steps as you cross the room one last time. By the door, a final quote is framed, faded ink scrawled at an angle. "Some foods feed the body, some feed the joke. Turnips do both if you let them." You smile and you do let them. The air shifts again as you step into a narrower hall, lined with softly glowing display cases. The floors are darker here. Creaky wood, occasionally interrupted by quiet pools of carpet. It smells faintly of lemon oil and dried paper. You pass under an arched wooden sign, more austere than the previous ones, inventing the impossible, failed decorative turnip devices and oddities. At last, The blooper reel. You stifle a yawn as you wander deeper. The light dim but cozy, like the back room of a kindly but eccentric inventor. This room is a loving tribute to those whose enthusiasm outpaced their practicality, whose dreams were bigger than their root vegetables. The first case displays what appears to be a long metal cylinder with a crank on one end and a sad-looking turnip jammed into the other. A label reads, "The Turbo Peeler 3000, claimed to carve 12 roses per minute, mostly just exploded." There's a diagram beside it. Parchment, inked with beautiful, precise lines, and at least 3 annotations reading things like, "Do not stand in front of the blade," and "Why steam?" Further along, a more tragic entry, a ceramic mold for a turnip portrait plaque. The idea, as the notes explain, was to press a likeness, say, of your spouse, into a slice of cooked turnip and present it as a sentimental centerpiece. Unfortunately, cooked turnips shrink. The results were unflattering at best. One surviving example looks like a vaguely startled turtle with sideburns. Historians still argue whether this was ever meant to be used seriously. Some believe it was a gag gift among aristocrats. Others insist it was an early attempt at edible memorial art before photography was widespread. Either way, no one was flattered. You pause at a case displaying a heavy contraption resembling a microscope crossed with a lemon juicer. It's labeled the Rootoscope. You're not sure what it was meant to do. A note reads, "Purpose unclear. Possibly designed to rate the charisma of turnips. Possibly a hat rack." You snort, a little too loudly. The wall behind you is covered in faded posters advertising long-forgotten devices. The Spiral-O-Matic. Introducing the turnip chime. Ring in your meal with rooty resonance. Now with parsnip compatibility. A special corner is devoted to exploding edibles. These were dishes or sculptures built with spring mechanisms meant to open or bloom upon serving. The most infamous, the 1879 turnip swan surprise, in which the swan's head popped off dramatically to reveal poached pears. The timing failed. The pears launched. 3 guests were struck. One sketch shows a host mid-toast, ducking as fruit flies past his wig. But for every ridiculous invention, there's a sweetness here, a kind of hopeful absurdity. One particularly charming item, a clockwork napkin ring that, when wound, slowly spun a turnip on a little platform to showcase its full carved detailing. It took 2 minutes to complete 1 revolution. No one had the patience. But it still works, and as you watch it now, the little platform whirs quietly, presenting the turnip like it's accepting an award. You begin to feel something surprisingly tender. These weren't failures, really. They were dreams. Fantastical solutions to problems no one had. Embodied hope that even a humble root could sparkle, could delight, could transform dinner into a carnival of wonder and slight danger. There's a shelf filled with discarded prototypes, half-shaved turnips, curled into coils and stuck together with pins, dried-out glue bottles, miniature flags meant to be planted in mashed potato terrain. One is simply labeled ambitious, but not entirely legal. Beside it, a guest book rests open. You're invited to add your own idea. Someone has written in looping pencil, "Turnip yo-yo, will never work, I don't care." You consider adding turnip-shaped pillow, already napping on one, but your handwriting's too sleepy. At the back of the room, a single spotlight illuminates a tall plinth. On it, a small, uncarved, perfectly ordinary turnip. The plaque reads, "This turnip did absolutely nothing, and for that, we honor it." You smile, there's peace in that too. Not everything has to work. Not every dream has to be useful. Some can just be soft, silly, or delightfully flawed. And even then, even as messes or misfires or unloved ideas, they matter. Because they were made. Because someone tried. You linger a moment longer. watching the rotoscope tilt ever so slightly. It still squeaks. Possibly on purpose. Possibly not. You bow slightly to the turnip on the plinth, honoring its beautiful uselessness. And then, with a yawn so wide your jaw cracks faintly, you carry on. The hall narrows again, but now it opens into something altogether more luxurious, though still softly lit, gently absurd, and coated in that same dreamlike hush that's followed you for what feels like days. The sign here is gilded, etched in playful copperplate. Society and the turnip, status, satire, and social climbing through roots. The scent in this room is hard to place. Polish, rosewater, and something sweetly pickled. A string quartet murmurs quietly through a hidden speaker, and the parquet floor gleams under your slow, socked steps. It's a ballroom of sorts, but no dancing here. Not unless you count the waltz of egos and edible symbolism. You pause in front of the first display. A dinner seating chart from 1842, embroidered, yes, embroidered, on a long linen runner. Next to each guest's name is an assigned root vegetable motif. One Lord Winfield was seated near a sculpted radish bust, while his cousin, Lady Eugenia, was served a dessert inside a hollowed golden turnip. The key reads, radish, onker boldness, Fumins. Parsnip, humility. Turnip, stability. Carrot, aspiration. And suddenly it clicks. This wasn't just food decoration. This was edible social code. A language of glazes and garnishes, where the shape of your salad said something about your soul. Nearby, a small easel holds a watercolor from 1861, a caricature of a noblewoman in a dress entirely made of turnip leaves. A caption reads, "The Marchioness of M.N., ever the modest harvest." Apparently, she had once declared she ate only root vegetables in protest of the spicy sins of the continent. She was deeply unpopular, and occasionally mistaken for a hedge. Historians still argue whether these satirical illustrations were mocking the hosts or the guests. Probably both. Certainly everyone. A shadow box display labeled Turnip Tokens and Faux Titles shows little medals crafted from pressed beet pulp, once handed out during mock ceremonies at private salons. One particularly worn badge reads, Knight of the Order of the Starch. A corresponding invitation beside it, gold-leafed and needlessly dramatic, invites esteemed guests to the second annual banquet of the Noble Root League, wherein awards would be given for most decorative use of a vegetable in defense of empire. And yes, that's absurd. But it's also exactly the kind of thing bored aristocrats might have done between fox hunts and dubious poetry readings. One long wall is covered with painted portraits, not of people, of vegetables dressed as people. Each one is part of a satirical art series from the late 1800s known as Rooted Nobility. There's a turnip in a powdered wig, a beet in a velvet robe, even a smug yam in military regalia. You pause longest at the Viscount of Rutabaga, who seems to be glaring at you with mild judgment. His mustache is clearly made of chive. There's a mirror across from the portraits, and as you glance into it, you realize someone has written on the glass in delicate calligraphy. You too could be nobility, with enough polish and parsley. You nod slowly. Fair enough. Moving on, you come across a table with tiny, exquisitely crafted place cards, each printed with edible ink onto dried turnip slices. This was a real fad, apparently, for a short season in the 1850s. Hostesses would commission artists to write guests' names on these cards, and then infuse them with essential oils for scent. One attendee, it's noted, accidentally ate his own name and later complained of tasting like bergamot for a week. The exhibit ends with a short film looping quietly in the corner. A recreation of a society dinner from 1888, where each course is accompanied by over-the-top performances. A dramatic reading of Ode to a Vegetable, a faux duel between rival soup chefs, and a slow unveiling of the main course, a massive turnip tower adorned with edible gold, topped with a live songbird. The bird promptly flew into the chandelier. A newspaper clipping on display reads simply, "Turnip triumph marred by canary incident." You sigh happily, because of course the turnip found its way into all this, into salons and scandals and symbolism. Because of course something as unassuming as a root vegetable would become the canvas for human absurdity. Because nothing says fragile status games like assigning spiritual traits to tubers. Still, there's something strangely endearing about the whole thing. The way people tried to elevate the ordinary, to find meaning in the meal, to laugh at themselves and each other, and occasionally, yes, at the tragic elegance of a poorly carved rutabaga. You trail your fingers across the velvet table runner as you exit the room. A single embroidered phrase glitters in the dim light. All roots run deep, but only some are invited to dinner. And with that thought tickling the back of your brain, you move softly on, a little more aware of the turnip's strange and noble career through the hierarchy of history. You've wandered through gardens and feasts, inventions and satire. But as you step into the next space, it feels less like a continuation and more like a quiet sigh, a decompression. The floor softens beneath your feet, some kind of deep pile rug in hushed gray-blue tones. The lighting is even lower here, almost like dusk. Soft lamps glow from sconces shaped like gently wilting leaves. There's no sign at the entrance this time. Just a small engraved plaque on a table that reads, "Reflections when the turnip goes quiet." This room is not filled with drama or whimsy, no exploding swans, no root nobility in wigs. Instead, you are surrounded by moments, unassuming, brief, and strangely moving. To your left, a wide, wall-mounted case holds dozens of handwritten recipe cards. Some are fancy, curling Victorian script, monogrammed initials, but most are practical, stained, smudged, folded once too many times. You lean closer and begin to read. Mrs. Croft's winter stew. To stretch a meal for 6 using 4 things. Baby soothing broth. Mineral root bake. Some of these aren't even recipes. One card says simply, "We boiled this one and it didn't hurt anyone." That's enough. You smile, because there's something comforting here, about food that doesn't need to impress, about a root that just shows up, does the job, feeds whoever needs feeding. Historians still argue whether the turnip's eventual decline in haute cuisine circles was due to class perception or changing agricultural trends. But here, in this quiet corner, none of that matters. Because the turnip never really left. It just stopped trying to dress up for company. A nearby rocking chair creaks slightly as you pass. No one's in it, but its movement makes the whole room feel gently haunted. Not spooky, just remembered. You take a seat on a low bench by a window, though of course there's no real view. Just a painted one. Fields, muted with morning fog, a crooked fence line, and a single wooden wheelbarrow parked beside a tidy garden bed. The illusion is soft, calming. You could believe you're there, just waking up on an autumn morning with warm breath clouding in the air. Next to the bench is a small basket filled with woolen turnips. Someone's knitted them, down to the little purplish shoulders and leafy green tops. One has a little tag. Please hold one if your hands feel fidgety. So you do. It's heavier than you expect, comfortingly so. You turn to a nearby wall of framed notes and quiet confessions. They're handwritten on slips of parchment, yellowed with time, and arranged like a constellation. Some are anonymous, some signed only with initials. A few examples. We didn't have much, but I remember there was always something warm in the bowl. I grew up thinking turnips were fancy. We only had them on birthdays. When Mum was sick, I made her mash. It didn't cure anything, but it helped. They're ugly, yes, but they listen. And that one sticks with you. Because it feels oddly true. The turnip never grandstands, never upstages. It just shows up, rooted, waiting, taking whatever heat it's given and coming out softer, milder, better for it. You think about all the unphotographed meals it starred in, all the tired hands that peeled it, the quiet gratitude it fed. A final alcove contains a low-lit table with a single bowl resting in the center. Plain, glazed ceramic. Inside is a replica of turnip stew. Simple root slices in broth, flecks of parsley, a chunk of crusty bread resting against the edge. You can't smell it. It's not real. But something about it feels sacred. Beside the bowl is a card that reads, "This was someone's favorite meal. They never said why, but they always finished it." You stay for a long moment, not because you have to, just because it's peaceful. Because all the banquet dazzle and courtly flourishes, all the poetic swans and mechanical disasters, they were wonderful. But they all led to this. A small bowl, a root boiled, a memory wrapped in steam. You rise slowly, tuck the wool turnip gently back in its basket. And before you step out of the room, you notice something pinned to the door frame. Something almost too small to see. A slip of paper in nearly invisible pencil. The turnip doesn't need to be funny or clever or carved. It just needs to be there when you're hungry. You breathe in, deep and even, and move on, softer somehow. The next room greets you with unexpected warmth. Not the figurative kind, but actual heat. The kind that hugs your cheeks gently like a sunlit kitchen after the oven's been on all morning. A low hum vibrates faintly through the floorboards, not unpleasant, like the old quiet of a home in winter. You've walked through history, art, satire, and sentiment, but now you step into something more alive. The plaque above you reads, "The Modern Revival, Turnips in Today's Gentle Kitchens." It's like entering the calm corner of a bustling cooking show, hosted by someone's kindly grandmother, filmed entirely in soft lighting with orchestral harp transitions. On one wall, a slow, looping video plays. Time-lapse footage of a turnip garden growing from seed to harvest, overlaid with delicate piano music. Roots stretching downward, leaves unfurling upward. It's more mesmerizing than it has any right to be. To your right, a series of framed photographs, glossy, warmly lit dishes from modern kitchens around the world. A Japanese turnip simmered gently in dashi. A Moroccan stew with preserved lemon and cubed purple roots. A Scandinavian root mash served beside something smoked and poetic. Each dish bears a small, handwritten note. Not a recipe, just a mood. Made this when the dog came home from surgery. Good with thick socks and silence. Too plain for the book club. Just right for me. You smile. Here are people still finding quiet joy in a vegetable that once wore hats made of butter and stood center stage beside peacocks. Now, it returns to the margins. Not in shame, but in peace. No longer trying to impress, only to comfort. Historians still argue whether the resurgence of humble ingredients in modern cuisine is driven by nostalgia, economics, or resistance to complexity. But maybe it's not a trend at all. Maybe it's just the circle turning. In the center of the room stands a long, simple kitchen table. The kind that begs for elbows and tea mugs and deep sighs. On it, a small stack of cookbooks, softly used. Post-it notes sprout from their pages like sleepy bookmarks. One lies open to a recipe for turnip gratin for when you don't want to talk to anyone. The ingredients are minimal. The instructions kind. A sign invites you to sit. So you do. The bench creaks. familiar and unashamed. Across from you, no one sits, but it doesn't feel empty. A row of photographs lines the center of the table. Ordinary families in kitchens across time. No banquet halls, no silver domes, just tired eyes, warm light, and turnips. Sliced, mashed, roasted. One image shows a toddler asleep at the table, a half-eaten root still clutched in one chubby fist. Another features a grandmother stirring soup with a ladle larger than her wrist, eyes closed as if listening to some recipe remembered only by muscle memory. Beside the table, a display of kitchen tools. A hand-cranked peeler, well-worn cutting boards, a ceramic stew pot with a hairline crack. None of it's pristine. All of it's loved. There's even a small handwritten note tacked to the wall. Unsigned, penciled on a grocery list scrap. I don't like turnips, but I like the way she made them. You rest your hands on the table's edge. There's something grounding in the grain of the wood, the worn edge where countless hands before yours have leaned, peeled, stirred, waited. Turnips, you realize, are patient food. They ask you to slow down, to peel gently, to taste without expectation. They will not dazzle. But they will be there. Near the doorway, a small interactive display offers a rotating reel of modern home cooks sharing quiet turnip memories. Their voices are soft, almost whispers. We always had them at Lunar New Year. They weren't the star, just always there. My dad insisted they were lucky. I think he just liked the color. They smell like October to me, like damp leaves and rain waiting. One screen fades to black, then shows only this text. The turnip didn't ask for a comeback, but it got one anyway. You glance back once more at the table, the photos, the sleepy baby, the whispering cookbooks. This isn't the turnip of pageantry or parody. This is the turnip that shows up quietly in the quiet parts of your life. The Monday evenings, the rainy lunches, the meals made not for guests, but for you. You stand slowly. You've been walking through centuries of strange and beautiful nonsense, and yet this room, gentle, modern, and sincerely small, is the one that wraps itself around you. And as you move toward the final doorway, you catch one last plaque, placed low, like it wasn't sure it deserved its own display. Etched in soft script, not everything needs to be special. Some things just need to be yours. And with that, you continue on. The doorway you pass through now is neither grand nor especially memorable. In fact, for a moment you wonder if you've gone the wrong way. It feels like stepping behind the scenes, into the quiet spine of the place. No velvet drapes, no glass cases, just warm wood, soft light, and the hush of a room not trying to be anything but what it is. This is the final chamber. There's no plaque this time, no clever title. But across one wall, embroidered in long, looping script, you read, "In the end, it was just a turnip." And somehow that feels right. The room is circular, designed like a contemplative chapel, but instead of stained glass or frescoes, the curved walls are lined with shelves, simple wood, unpolished, each cubby holding a single object. You begin to walk the perimeter slowly, each item its own story, its own quiet echo of all you've seen. In one, a dried bouquet of turnip greens, preserved in a little bundle tied with kitchen string. Next to it, a note. These were from the last harvest before the war. Mum saved them, just in case. In another, a child's watercolor painting. Just a purple blob with green scribbles, labeled in uneven pencil. My Turnap. The A backwards. A thumbprint smudged across one corner. You feel your chest pull slightly. A wooden spoon, worn thin at the edges. A porcelain dish with a hairline crack. A photo of an elderly man in a wool sweater, smiling shyly while holding a casserole dish, as if unsure how to pose. Every few steps, you come across something else. Not remarkable, but gently human. and nearly all connected to meals made in silence, in routine, in love. You find a newspaper clipping of a local fair's turnip carving contest. Children posing beside wildly lopsided sculptures, their faces brighter than the candles inside. Historians still argue whether the modern obsession with small joys is a coping mechanism or a return to pre-industrial values. But standing here, surrounded by lives you don't know but somehow understand, it doesn't matter what the analysts say. These aren't symbols, they're moments. And turnips, it turns out, have always been better at moments than metaphors. You step toward the center of the room, where a circular bench surrounds a low plinth. On it, lit by a single warm overhead bulb, is the simplest display of all, a wooden bowl. Inside, a fresh turnip, uncarved, unpolished, just washed, a little wet still at the base, its skin slightly dimpled, the green top trimmed but not removed entirely. There is no label, there is no backstory. There is just this, the turnip, a root, a food, a blank canvas, a recurring joke, a survivor of centuries of taste, fashion, failure, and fondness. You sit on the bench. Slowly. Let your breath match the rhythm of the room. It's so quiet now that you can hear the small hum of the lighting. You can hear your own thoughts soften. This was never about vegetables, really. It was about the need to create beauty, even from the plainest things. It was about what people do when given time, tools, and just enough ridiculousness to make something lovely. It was about holding the world gently, carving it carefully, and setting it down for others to admire, even if they laughed, even if it wilted by morning, even if the soup never got made. You look at the turnip. It looks back. Not with wisdom, not with mystery, just with the soft, blank presence of something that's always been here, waiting to be peeled, roasted, forgotten, or honored. And you think, that's enough. That's more than enough. You lean back. The wood beneath you creaks, but in a friendly way. Somewhere outside this room, life continues. Louder, sharper, quicker. But here, in this little temple of tuberous memory, time has softened its edges, and you are very nearly asleep. Now, as we leave this strange, quiet journey behind, let yourself drift into a softer place. You've wandered through centuries of gentle nonsense. You've met sculptors, gardeners, footmen, duchesses, pranksters, and kitchen ghosts, all of them quietly orbiting a vegetable that never asked for attention, but somehow became unforgettable. You've seen it gilded and carved, exploded and embroidered, mocked and adored. And through all of it, you've walked slowly, listened closely. Let yourself notice the smallest things. So now, it's time to let go of noticing. To let your thoughts melt into the hum of sleep, like butter on warm mash. Let the rooms blur together. Let the tiny beat oarsman row into the distance. Let the woolen turnip rest in your palm, heavy and soft. Breathe in deeply, and then again, but slower. There's no need to think anymore. Not about turnips, not about banquets, not about anything at all. Just the low, comforting rhythm of your breath. The softness of blankets around your shoulders. The quiet satisfaction of a story, gently, absurdly told. And the peace of knowing that even the humblest things, when seen with care, when remembered with kindness, can become something beautiful. Something worth carving, or painting, or simply holding. Sleep now, with the faint scent of soil and soup in your dreams. And tomorrow, if you think of it, give a nod to the produce aisle. The turnip's still there, waiting, as always. Sweet dreams. Good night.